Council, the committee is convening to hold Wells Fargo accountable. As part of this oversight, we will be looking at legislation to do just that. While the Federal Reserve's asset cap was a good start, it didn't seem to change the bank's behavior. Accordingly, we will discuss a number of bills that would compel further action by regulators and rein in abusive megabanks like Wells Fargo to hold them, including their management and boards, accountable for their actions. Thank you, and now the chair recognizes the ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, for 4 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle made up their minds about Wells Fargo long ago. In fact, before we received a single document, the now chair of the committee in 2016 said that she had, quote, come to the conclusion that Wells Fargo should be broken up. It's too big to manage, end quote. Again, that was before the committee received a single document or reviewed even a shred of evidence into the investigation of Wells Fargo's sales practices. Now, after reviewing 500,000 documents that both the Democrats and Republicans on this committee have access to, and hundreds of pages of witness testimony, we know breaking up the bank is not the answer. Wells Fargo isn't too big to manage. The findings of these documents show that it was grossly mismanaged. The evidence shows the source of the company's problem was its federated structure and the leadership team that couldn't fix it. Those are the issues that are unique to Wells Fargo, and Wells Fargo was uniquely mismanaged. However, the evidence does not tell us much about Wells Fargo's large bank peers. So we're going to spend all day hearing from Wells Fargo's brand new CEO, who has been on the job for all of about 6 months, who has no connection to the period in question. And tomorrow we're going to drag up 2 former board members for the sole purpose of embarrassing them. And there are documents that are deeply embarrassing to those board members and to the then board of Wells Fargo. That is true. The chairwoman called on them to resign, and they did. In fact, the markets were calling on them to resign. The system works. I'm not sure that what we hope to accomplish tomorrow with witnesses who are no longer in a position to fix the company moving forward. I would offer we don't have the luxury of 3 politically motivated, ideological hearings on Wells Fargo right now. There are serious things happening in the world while we're having this hearing. Investors' fear over the spread of coronavirus has had widespread consequences for the financial services industry, the economy, and the markets. Our constituents have real concerns, and they expect us to put aside politics and focus on the urgent matter at hand. But we're going to spend the day asking Mr. Scharf over and over again how he intends to fix the bank. Here are the facts. Mr. Scharf and his team released a plan, and it looks good on paper. We'll hold him accountable for executing that plan. In fact, his stockholders will hold him accountable for that plan. And the regulators and the Justice Department will hold him accountable for executing that plan. In fact, the regulators and the Justice Department have been extremely aggressive during the Trump administration on Wells Fargo. We'll continue to hear from them about whether or not Mr. Scharf's plans are working, and we expect them to stay engaged. I look forward to this hearing today, Mr. Scharf, but I think at least some of our members will want to know what you're doing to prepare for your massive footprint of employees, how you're going to protect their safety, how you're going to protect the safety and soundness of your institution, given what's happening in the marketplace and the fears we have in reaction to this virus, and the impact that my consumers, my constituents, will have with changes to credit card, mortgages, and other things in light of this crisis. So with that, Madam Chair, I'd like to introduce 4 documents into the record. These are waivers to allow Mr. Scharf to discuss certain confidential supervisory information. These were issued by the CFPB, the OCC, and the Federal Reserve. 2 important notes about these waivers. First, they're not blanket waivers to discuss CSI. Mr. Scharf was asked not to discuss OCC's CAMELS ratings, OCC risk assessments, and the Fed's supervisory ratings. Second, he's been asked not to name supervisory staff. I think it would be unfair to put him in a position to either answer our question or violate regulatory directives. And so with that, Mr. Scharf, I appreciate you and your company requesting these waivers so you can be more forthright with this committee. And with that, I would ask unanimous consent to submit the March 6th letter from the CFPB, the March 5th letter from the OCC, and 2 March 6th letters from the Federal Reserve detailing what I have outlined.
Thank you very much. I'd like to know.
Without objection, I'd like to submit.
Without objection, the documents are accepted.
Thank you.
I would also like to know if you have permission to disclose the waivers. I understand the agency asked us not to do that.
Well, I was not asked by the agencies to not do that, and so therefore I've just said it in public what they outlined. These are letters to you and Mr. Green, and I am CC'd on these things. Had they had that request, I would have liked to have heard it before announcing it here to you today and to everyone on this committee.
Well, that is what I understand.
But I think it's important.
And we've already heard 5 hours of testimony from then CEO Stump when I called for Wells Fargo to be broken up, so I'd like to clear the record on that. Without objection, your information is inserted into the record. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, Mr. Green, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, my constituents would like to know how is it that Wells Fargo can pay a $3 billion fine, commit fraud, open accounts without knowledge of customers, and not one person goes to jail. Of all of the top banks, the so-called too big to fail banks, there has never been a CEO, a top officer of any of these too big to fail banks to go to jail. It seems that they are not only too big to fail, they're also too big to jail. This issue has to be resolved, and it cannot be resolved by simply paying off the government. Wells Fargo has to do more to atone for its transgressions. The more that it has to do will involve how it treats its employees, what it will do to make sure that this never happens again. But more importantly than all of these, Wells Fargo has got to understand that it cannot continue with what appears to be a criminal enterprise. I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair now recognizes the subcommittee ranking member, Mr. Barr, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters and Ranking Member McHenry. Mr. Scharf, welcome back to the committee for your appearance in your new and current role. The scandals plaguing Wells Fargo and senior management's failure to address the problems and their aftermath represented a breach of public trust and a significant shortfall in consumer protection. We are not here to relitigate the details of those practices, which the committee covered in previous hearings and reports. We are here to understand what the new management has done to correct mistakes of the past, how they are complying with regulators' directives, and their plans to ensure this doesn't happen again. Wells Fargo's individualized misconduct sparked unfair anti-bank rhetoric that has been applied to all banks of all sizes, much of which you will hear from my colleagues today. But labeling all banks as the villains of capitalism makes it easier for some on the far left to justify their quest to impose socialism on our free market economy and politicize access to capital. We are here to focus on only one isolated bank and its path to rebuild trust. Mr. Scharf, I look forward to learning about the work you've done to change the culture at the bank and to working with you to ensure Wells Fargo upholds its promises. I yield back.
I want to welcome to the committee Charles W. Scharf, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Wells Fargo Company. Mr. Scharf has held this position with Wells Fargo and Company since October 2019. Previously, Mr. Scharf has served as a senior official at a number of financial institutions, including as Chief Executive Officer at Visa Incorporated, and as Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of the Board at Bank of New York Mellon. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. But before we begin, I would like to share the witness in. Mr. Scharf, please stand and raise your right hand. Thank you. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you will give before this committee in the matters now under consideration will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help you God. Thank you. Let the record show that the witness answered in the affirmative. You may take your seat. Mr. Scharf, you will have 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. When you have 1 minute remaining, a yellow light will appear. At that time, I would ask you to wrap up your testimony so we can be respectful of the committee members' times. Mr. Scharf, you are now recognized to present your oral testimony.
Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, members of the committee, good morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. I joined Wells Fargo just over 4 months ago after serving as CEO of BNY Mellon and Visa. And while it's early days, I welcome the opportunity to discuss the next steps for Wells Fargo. The members of this committee are familiar with Wells Fargo's history. Our failings have been detailed recently in both the settlement with the DOJ and SEC, as well as the administrative actions taken by the OCC against former employees. These matters describe deeply disturbing conduct that is utterly unacceptable and has no place in our company. In addition, the recently released reports from this committee reinforce what I have said since I arrived, that we have not done what's necessary to address our shortcomings. Simply said, we had a flawed business model in how the company was managed. Our structure and culture were problematic, and the company's leadership failed its stakeholders. But today, I'd like to talk to you about our plan to chart a better course. I took this job because I believe that our country and communities benefit from a strong Wells Fargo. I'm confident we can do what's necessary to move this company in a significantly improved direction. While it will take time, the transformation has begun, and I realize the path forward will be difficult. And though I realize the path forward will be difficult, I'm optimistic of our future. Here are some important steps we've taken so far. First, I provided an honest assessment, both internally and externally, of our significant shortcomings and our failure to effectively address them. Second, I made it clear, also internally and externally, that we must prioritize the work outlined by our regulators above all else. Completing that work is essential to ensuring the company is run with the highest standards of both operational excellence and integrity. Third, I'm making substantial changes to our leadership team. I brought in 3 new leaders and expect to add 2 more soon from outside the company to join our operating committee. Almost 75% of that group will be new to the company since 2018. Hiring experienced people with proven track records in the issues we face is necessary to bring about the change required. Fourth, we reorganized the structure of our businesses to ensure we have clear responsibility and accountability. We created a new role, Chief Operating Officer, who will ensure that high quality, consistent execution and operational excellence become part of our culture, especially with regard to our regulatory work. We announced a flatter organizational structure with more direct representation on our operating committee. This will give me clear line of sight and more direct involvement across the company. It will also provide greater transparency into how our businesses are working, what kinds of risks they're taking on, how they're treating customers, and whether they're operating at the highest standards. Fifth, we're introducing a new set of processes to thoroughly review our progress against our regulatory work. Sixth, we altered our evaluation and compensation practices and have significantly greater accountability and will continue to make tough decisions around our leaders. Seventh, we're redefining our culture, especially regarding how we work together. We will have a strong, centralized control infrastructure. We will ensure we have the right people in the right roles. We will move with a sense of urgency. We will hold each other accountable for our commitments, and we will judge ourselves based upon our outcomes, not our words. But most importantly, the guiding principle in how we make business decisions must be that everything starts and ends with our customers. We must put them first in our decision-making in all we do. As we move forward, I have no preconceived notions about what size our bank should be, but I firmly believe that we must be able to manage all of it. I also know that progress in our plan will take time and that ultimately our regulators will decide when we have met our obligations under the consent orders. My commitment to our regulators is that we will approach this work with the greatest sense of urgency. To my colleagues at Wells Fargo, you deserve more from the bank's leadership. and the failings that occurred in the past have made your jobs difficult. I'm committed to doing better as we seek to ensure that such things never occur again at Wells Fargo. And to the committee, I want to give you my personal assurance that we will do the work necessary to put Wells Fargo on a sound footing with our customers, employees, regulators, shareholders, and communities. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. I would now like to engage you with a few questions that I have about some of the findings that were reported in the investigation that was done by the majority staff. According to the committee's majority staff report, there are currently dozens of consumer abuses that each affect more than 50,000 customers or accounts or require more than $10 million in remediation. Mr. Scharf, this is one of the most troubling findings of the report because after more than 3.5 years under consent orders, Wells Fargo may still be harming millions of consumers. Exactly how many consumers were harmed by the bank as a result of the dozens of abuses cited in the report?
Chairwoman, I do not know the answer to that question.
Will any consumer that has been harmed by the bank and identified receive payment and have their credit reporting fixed within the next 30 days?
Chairwoman, our taking care of our customers is the most important thing for us. We're in the process of doing all of the work that's required of us to remediate everything that we possibly can. It will certainly take longer than that, but the process has to be complete, it has to be thorough, and we're committed to doing it.
How long will it take for these consumers to receive payment and their credit reported fixed? I asked about 30 days. You have not answered that directly. About how long do you think it would take?
Chairwoman, as of now, our plans take us into 2021 to ensure that all of the payments are made appropriately. We're taking a fresh look at how we do remediation to make sure that we're being as thorough as we possibly can and remediate everyone we should, and to ask the question, are there changes that we can make to our processes to get this done more quickly?
My concern has only deepened in the past week as I think about the millions of customers who will be looking to Wells Fargo to support them through the economic pain inflicted by coronavirus. While Wells Fargo and its foundation have offered about $11 million to support efforts to combat the virus, mega banks like yours will be asked to forbear payments on mortgages, credit cards, and other consumer debts. How can your customers, regulators, Congress, and the public have any confidence in your institution's ability to support your customers when you have dozens of ongoing instances of consumer abuse?
Chairwoman, I appreciate and understand the question. All I can tell you is that we are approaching the virus, I think, the way you would expect us to, which is we are thinking about it in terms of what it really means for every American out there. It's certainly how I think about it, and starting with those that are the most affected. And so as we think about what we could be doing relative to late fees, missed payments, and things like that, we want our customers to believe that we're a source of strength for them, and we're going to approach it that way.
I know that you understand we'll be looking for a lot more specificity than you have just described. Now, I know that you became CEO just 4 months ago and that you think there are lots of changes needed at Wells Fargo. However, I think that absent significant reductions in Wells Fargo's footprint, you and the bank will never be able to rein in the culture of consumer abuse. What can you tell us about reducing the footprint?
Chairwoman, what I can tell you is that we have sold off businesses over the last several years, and we continue to look at what the makeup of the company is. My first priority since I arrived at the company only 4 months ago, as you mentioned, is to ask the questions around what do we have to do to get the regulatory work in far better shape than it is. At the same time, we've launched a series of meetings where we're looking across the company at what we do to answer the question, does everything belong under the roof at Wells Fargo? And just given the priorities that I have, my expectation is that that will take through the end of the year to accomplish that work.
As you know, the asset cap there's a cap on the assets of the bank. Have you been trying to undo that since you've been in, or have you left that alone, or do you think that's fair?
I don't have any knowledge of us trying to do anything other than abide by it, although we obviously are trying to do the work necessary that'll satisfy our regulators. I believe that given where we are, it's appropriate, and I'm focused on getting the work done that's required by the Federal Reserve.
Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time. The gentleman from North Carolina, Ranking Member Mr. McHenry, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for your testimony. We understand your plan, as you've outlined. You've outlined this to the markets. You've outlined it to committee members. You've outlined briefly in your opening statement your intentions to right this ship, to remedy customer harm as quickly as possible, to comply with regulatory orders. The failure of Wells Fargo is not a failure of some sort of innovation. It was a lack of it, lack of adapting to the new marketplace, lack of adhering to existing laws and regulatory orders. And when regulators called the institution on those breaking orders, they refused to comply in a timely manner. Therefore, your last CEO, your predecessor, was bounced as a result of that. So both Democrats and Republicans on this committee have issued reports. Here's the Republican report. So in this report, we outlined the consumer harm and the risk management failures of your institution. Have you reviewed both these reports?
Yes, I have.
Okay. So I know you may disagree with some conclusions that we have in terms of policy for the Republican side or Democrat side, but the findings of fact, do you have any disagreements with the Democrat report or the Republican report?
I do not, and the only thing I would add is my reaction to what's in those reports is probably very similar to yours.
Which is what?
Which is that series of behavior that's described should have never happened at the company. The failures that are described are a direct result of us not managing the company properly. I do believe that it's possible to manage the company differently to fulfill the responsibilities that we have, but it's clear when you read the report, and I said during my opening statement that it's consistent with what I found since I arrived at the company, that we've not done what's necessary to be done, but it is possible to do it.
Okay. So I want to zero in on this federated structure that you are, as you outlined in your plan, that you intend to create an enterprise-wide risk control system similar to your peers. Is that true?
Yes, it is, Ranking Member.
Why?
Because there is no way that a company with multiple businesses can ensure that it's doing the right thing across the entire enterprise unless you're taking a consistent view of that.
So you need greater visibility into risk across the enterprise.
You need greater visibility, and you need a group of folks that are independent of the businesses, concurring or not, and making judgments.
Okay. So along those lines, your experience in your previous roles as CEO roles, you're trying to bring that expertise for risk management to this enterprise.
Absolutely, as well as the practices of other large institutions that have done this.
Okay. So in light of what has happened in the marketplace, in the broader market over the last month, is this institution well capitalized?
Ranking Member, I think we're extremely well capitalized. In fact, there's no question that the whole banking system is far better capitalized than it was back at the time of the financial crisis, whether it's the additional $1 billion of capital that the banks have, or the $3 trillion or so in deposits, and the liquid securities that the institutions
and you have the access to liquidity sufficient to get through any crisis you would foresee?
Yes, absolutely believe.
Okay. So in terms of safety and soundness, you're mitigating customer harm from the previous regime. That's positive. In terms of safety and soundness and risk management, you're cleaning up the ship. So our expectations is we should have no problems from you in terms of safety and soundness. Is that fair?
I think it's fair to say once we finish the work that I've laid out, absolutely you should feel that way.
Okay. So how many employees do you have at Wells Fargo?
I have approximately 265,000.
Okay. And many are customer facing. How many are customer facing?
I don't know the answer, but it has to be easily 100,000.
Sure. So do you have plans in order to respond to the current threats because of COVID-19 and what is happening across the country, especially in your footprint in California?
Absolutely. We are, as I said,
as well as Washington State and other prime areas that have seen an outbreak.
Our approach on COVID-19 is that we should do anything that we can to ensure the safety of our employees as well as be helpful for our customers. We have an open line with them. Wherever there is any concern, we encourage folks to work from home. I believe yesterday we had 62,000 people logged in working from home. And to the extent that there are issues within the institution, we're going to do everything we can to protect everyone else.
Thank you.
Let the record show that during this investigation, all of the information was shared with the Republicans, and they tried to rush a report out before we got ours out. This ranking member would like to have it both ways. The gentleman
Madam Chair, to that order, point of personal privilege, Madam Chair.
Point of personal privilege.
We both issued reports, both the majority and minority, as I outlined in my statement. I was not imputing your report. I was imputing the conclusions of your report.
Whatever you were doing, Mr. McHenry, you're trying to have it both ways. You're saying that
we can have this debate in front of everyone, or we can get on with the hearing.
Yes, we can. And as the chair of the committee, if you want to have this debate, we'll have this debate.
But you issued a
report. The
gentlewoman
from New York, Ms. Maloney, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Don't take shots at me without giving me the opportunity to respond.
You have responded. The gentlewoman's time is now recognized.
I thank the chair lady for yielding. Mr. Scharf, you were brought in to clean things up and to change the culture at Wells Fargo, and I certainly hope you do. I would like to talk about one area where I believe you do need to change direction. When your predecessor, Tim Sloan, testified last year, I asked him about Wells Fargo's policies on financing the gun industry, which their policies are absolutely egregious. Your bank has been financing gun manufacturers that are making weapons that are literally killing our children and our neighbors. Mr. Sloan said that he didn't think Wells Fargo should, quote, go above and beyond what the law requires on guns, even though the bank explicitly states that it goes above and beyond the law in many areas, including human rights. So he refused to revise Wells Fargo's policies on financing the gun industry. Many of your competitors, such as Citibank and Bank of America, already have sensible policies to ensure responsible lending to their businesses with the gun industry. Under the Citi policy, all of the bank's business partners in the gun industry must require a background check before they sell a firearm, and they prohibit the selling of firearms to teenagers. These, I believe, are common sense policies that will increase public safety and save lives. So I want to ask you, will you commit to changing Wells Fargo's policy on financing the gun industry?
Congressman, first of all, I do want to say I share your concerns about the impact of guns. Sitting here today, I don't personally believe that I know enough to make that commitment, but I know that it's something that we need to be far more thoughtful about. I know that we have created some financing for some nonpartisan research, and as part of that, we need to go back and to make sure that we're thinking about what the right thing to do is in a series of sensitive industries. And I'm not making a judgment one way or the other. It's just not something that I've spent enough time on yet, but I recognize your concerns.
Well, thank you. And after you reviewed this policy and made your decision, will you get back to the committee in writing about your decision and the reasons for making that decision, respectfully?
Yes, Congresswoman.
Thank you. In the committee staff report, there's an email, and I want to compliment the committee on this excellent report. that has gotten really a lot of positive feedback. But in it, there's this email from your risk officer, Michael Loughton, where he said, and I quote, "If any of the $200 million in proposed customer remediation is left over, we promise to give it to charity only after the CFPB and the OCC let us out of the consent order. If they do not, no donation, put the onus back on them," end quote. So essentially your chief risk officer was trying to play hardball with the regulators over compensating the victims of the fake account scandal and over a charitable donation. And Mr. Sheriff, this committee really expects you to do the right thing by your customers that your bank has defrauded, and we expect you to work with your regulators to compensate them for the scandals and the misuse of their funds and other frauds. So I want to ask you, since you took over as CEO in October of 2019, what specific actions have you taken to address the OCC's concerns about how the bank remediates harmed consumers?
Thank you, Congresswoman. First of all, the gentleman you referred to is no longer the chief risk officer of the company. And certainly, when I read those comments, they're inexcusable and not something that should ever be thought of by someone inside of our company. To your question about what we're doing, first of all, we put in someone new to run our remediation process. That person reports to our new chief operating officer, who we brought in from the outside, who has experience in dealing with customer remediations. And the mandate that I've given them is to rethink what it is and how we do it. Don't stop the work that's ongoing, but going through piece by piece and asking the question, what can we do to ensure that we're doing everything we can for all of our customers as quickly as we possibly can.
Well, thank you. Do you know how many, earlier you were asked how many people were defrauded. Do you know now? At that time, they did not know.
The gentlelady's time has expired.
In writing, if you could respond.
The gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Mr. Scharf, thank you for joining us today and to update this committee on your progress as the brand new CEO of Wells Fargo. Placing one's money and wealth in the custody of an organization like Wells Fargo is one of the biggest displays of trust, and for many years consumers were betrayed and taken advantage of in order to meet sales performance goals and ultimately to improve earnings and share prices. That was categorically wrong. Not only did Wells Fargo and its employees fail these customers, some of whom are my constituents in Missouri's 2nd Congressional District, but our regulators failed as well. They neither identified nor prevented this malpractice from occurring in the first place. It was the Obama administration's OCC and CFPB that first uncovered this problem, but it was not, I should say, the OCC and the CFPB of the previous administration that first uncovered this problem. It was, in fact, the LA Times, the media, that first brought your company's practices to light. Mr. Scharf, your predecessors appeared before this committee and assured members that Wells Fargo was on track to complying with financial regulators' consent orders. The evidence outlined in the third report produced by committee's Republicans regarding Wells Fargo says otherwise. Your predecessor was overly optimistic about the bank's progress towards complying with the CFPB and OCC consent orders and the Federal Reserve Board's asset cap. His public statements assuring the bank's progress to achieving compliance did not match up with what was taking place behind the scenes. Mr. Scharf, I am cautiously optimistic that you are the right man for the job to bring the bank into compliance and put these scandals to rest. What makes you different from your predecessors to adequately address and resolve these deep-seated issues within Wells Fargo?
Thank you, Congresswoman. First of all, I've been lucky enough through my career to have a series of experiences at companies that have been both well-run and troubled. And coming out of those experiences, I believe that there are a series of things that I've learned that could be very applicable here. The things that I've done since I've come to Wells Fargo, I think, are in stark contrast to how we've approached some of these issues in the past. I think if you're inside the company, you feel like we're approaching these issues very, very differently. I've been very, very open and honest about our lack of progress, not pointing out the positives, but both being realistic, but also focusing on the negatives, because that's where we can have an impact. I believe the sense of urgency that people are working with inside the company is very different today than it was 4 months ago. I personally am spending the majority of my time on these issues, easily 75 to 80% of my time, not focused on growth, new businesses, anything like that.
Excuse me, Mr. Scharf, I'm not hearing any specifics here. What other changes are you going to implement? Wells Fargo's fragmented structure proved to be one of the root causes, I think, of the bank's ongoing compliance challenges. Can we expect to see additional changes to address major outstanding issues? Some specifics, please.
Absolutely. We're going to have a much stronger centralized core in everything that relates to risk and control. We're going to run the company as if it's one company with a consistent set of standards, a consistent set of policies. Everyone understands that, and we're going to have people in place that believe that that's the best way to run the company.
The committee's report found that Wells Fargo routinely requests extensions to deadlines for submitting remediation and reform plans. Regulators typically grant those requests, but the bank's plans remain insufficient, even with the extra time. Mr. Scharf, what steps are you taking to ensure Wells Fargo can submit these plans on time without deadline extensions? And are you still using these consultant contractors to draft plans to the CFPB and the OCC under the consent orders?
In addition to the things I just mentioned, Congresswoman, we're putting a substantially different group of people in charge of these issues. I personally and the operating committee are getting deeply involved in all of this. It's going to take time because, as you know, there are a series of orders that are outstanding, but we're trying to be as methodical as we can, going through piece by piece and managing it in a very different way, in a very tight way, just like you would manage any significant project in an institution like Wells Fargo.
I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Velasquez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Scharf, I don't like being misled, and I don't really like to being lied to. Last year, I asked your predecessor about the status of Wells Fargo compliance with the Federal Reserve's 2018 consent order. He responded to me by stating Wells Fargo had made the board governance and oversight improvements required by the Fed. We now know that is not true. As the new CEO, let me ask you, when do you expect Wells Fargo to be in compliance with the Fed's 2018 consent order?
Congresswoman, I can't give you an answer to that sitting here today. Ultimately, when they believe we're in compliance is what's important, not when we believe we're in compliance. What I can tell you is we have an enormous amount of resources on working on this. We're highly focused on it, as am I. But I cannot sit here today and give you a time frame.
Mr. Scharf, according to correspondence between Wells Fargo officials and the Fed, Wells Fargo will resubmit plans to address governance and risk management by April 30th, 2020. Do you still expect to resubmit a plan by April 2020?
Congresswoman, I can't answer that question today. We are focused on doing the work that's necessary as we review it. If we feel that it's in the condition that they would expect.
So your question is no. So Wells Fargo has already submitted 2 plans that have been rejected by the Fed and has been granted numerous extensions. Why will Wells Fargo not meet this deadline? Do you think we have a right to know?
Congresswoman.
This is your deadline, by the way, sir. This is Wells Fargo deadline.
Congresswoman, I understand exactly why you feel the way you do. What I can tell you is what I've discovered since I've gotten to the company. And my obligation is to make sure we're doing all the work that's necessary and being as honest as we can about what we can get done in what period of time.
So, sir, as we have been discussing, and you are the third CEO to come before this committee, Wells Fargo's failure to comply with the Fed's 2018 consent order derives from a culture that is focused on profits instead of risk management. As the new CEO, how will you emphasize operational risk management over profits at Wells Fargo?
Congresswoman, I think it's both in our words and our actions. I have said publicly, including on my first investor call, that this work will come ahead of everything else, and our financial results might be harmed because of
that. But that is exactly what this committee expects from you. You said and set a deadline of April 2020. That is the type of action that we need. You know, a lot of consumers of your consumers were misled and charged excessive fees for counts that they didn't sign up for. So, yes, I agree with the ranking member that we should be concerned about coronavirus and your workers, and for that fact and for that matter, workers across America. But you are responsible for the fact that too many consumers were overcharged for products that they didn't sign up to. And you are the third CEO. So my question is, if there's anything else that might be coming to light in terms of wrongdoing?
Congresswoman, not that I'm aware of. And I share the concerns that you have and agree that we have to do far better than we've done.
Chairwoman, I yield back, and thank you for holding this meeting, hearing, fulfilling our responsibility of oversight. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Scharf, I would like you to be as specific as you can possibly be about what you're doing to correct what was done to the consumers and how they're going to be repaid for it in the questions that will come back to you time and time again today. And so the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Scharf, over here. Yeah, welcome back to the committee, Mr. Scharf. And you are new to Wells Fargo, but you are not new to the job of running a global, systemically important bank. You recently left the position of Chief Executive Officer of BNY Mellon, another GSIB, global, systemically important bank. And given your past experience running a large and sophisticated global institution, do you believe that Wells Fargo is too big to manage, as some of my colleagues are suggesting?
No, I don't, Congressman.
What do you believe contributed more to Wells Fargo's past failures? Do you believe it was more of the culture and the management structure that was in place in the past, or do you believe it was the size of the institution?
Congressman, there's no question in my mind that the culture and the management structure of the company.
Because my friend from New York brought it up, I have to ask, do you believe that Wells Fargo's policy on financing firearms had anything to do whatsoever on the aggressive sales practices and the opening of unauthorized accounts?
Not at all to my knowledge.
I will say, just as an editorial comment, I believe that if your bank allows politics to impact lending decisions, it runs the risk of only distracting your bank from actually doing the things that you need to do to take on. No, I will not. To take on the task at hand, which is to reform the culture at the bank and to reform the management structure that you've identified as the problem. So please, I urge you to resist the temptation to politicize lending and focus on the actual issues at the institution. And to that end, let me ask you, in the past, Wells Fargo maintained a federated model in which core functions such as risk management were decentralized within business lines with little visibility from or accountability to Wells Fargo company leadership. This was a key management breakdown identified in the Republican report published last week. I understand that the company has moved to build out an enterprise-wide risk program like many of your peers. I think you've identified this as a flatter organizational structure. Is that correct?
Yes.
How will this flatter organizational structure correct the mistakes of the past?
Well, Congressman, I think it's a combination of both of the things that you referred to. I think there's no question that we need an independent control infrastructure that's not accountable to any individual line of business, and in the case of risk and the other functions like that, are accountable directly to our board of directors. That group is independent, makes independent judgments, and in combination with the management team around my table, where we have more direct exposure into the issues because you've got people at the table talking about them, allows us to be much, much more engaged with the independent control infrastructure at the same table, hearing the same thing, and having the ability to influence things before they become a problem.
Mr. Scharf, under your predecessor, Wells Fargo's responses to regulators' consent orders left something to be desired. They were late, incomplete, and totally insufficient. I think you've testified you agree to that. Further, the teams managing the consent order deliverables were frequently shifted around the org chart at Wells Fargo and subordinated within teams, suggesting a low relative importance in the overall pecking order. You've committed to maintaining a more hands-on oversight of the consent order process and working with regulators to ensure sufficient, timely compliance with your directors. I think your testimony was you're going to take this up as on an urgent basis. Urgent was your word. Would you please describe the changes you've made to the teams managing Wells Fargo's response to these various consent orders?
So we've centralized the management of all of these consent orders under our new chief operating officer, who came in from the outside, who has extensive experience in his prior role at dealing with similar issues. Under him, we have an organization that is organized around the work that's got to get done of the consent orders.
Well,
the centralized structure is very different than what we've had in the past.
Thank you. My time's almost expired. I agree with you when you say I believe that our country and communities would benefit from a strong Wells Fargo. I wish you all the best as you make these very important changes to correct these failures in the past, and I yield back.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, who is also the chair for the Subcommittee on Investor Protection, Entrepreneurship, and Capital Markets, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
The ranking member attacks the work of this committee while at the same time saying it's great that these two directors were forced to resign because there were highly embarrassing disclosures, so the system worked. These highly embarrassing disclosures. Madam Chair, did they arrive out of thin air? Were they presented to us by a demigod? No. These disclosures arose because of the work of our chair, Maxine Waters, the chair of the subcommittee, Al Green, and the Democratic staff. And had we continued the hear no evil, see no evil approach that this committee had the prior Congress, these embarrassing disclosures would never have come out, and these embarrassing board members would still be on your board. But regardless of the outrage, we cannot allow the outrages of the past to blind us to the crisis of the present. We've got a coronavirus. People are afraid. The economic system could get better, could get worse. Not only do we have a coronavirus, we have a sudden decline in oil prices that are shaking up the markets, and the fact that we have two problems doesn't immunize us from a third or a fourth thing happening. In fact, your bank has done stress tests to look at other things that could hit our economy. You've got a plan put in place 7 months ago to send $31.4 billion out of your capital and to your shareholders. You don't know, I don't know what this coronavirus is going to do to the world economy. You may not be too big to manage, you may be, but you are certainly too big to fail. Mr. Scharf, can you commit to this committee that you will suspend dividends and stock buybacks until we know what this coronavirus is going to do to the world's economy and to the solvency of your bank?
Congressman, we do a stress test, as you are aware, which puts all of the banks.
I'm aware of that, but that stress test was for some other stress happening, which could happen, and you have two stresses already. So you've done a stress test, but you haven't done a stress test where the other calamity occurs in the middle of a coronavirus that's infecting the entire world. So your stress test, we already have the stress. You haven't done a double stress test. You're too big to fail. You've injured our economy by the practices that we're here to discuss in this committee. Do you want to do something good for the country and commit to ending stock buybacks and dividends until we know what the coronavirus is going to do to your bank's solvency?
Congressman, we're committed to...
Yes or no? I have limited time. Yes or no?
Congressman, we're going to run the bank the way we think is prudent with our regulators.
In other words, you're having dealt harshly with consumers in the past, you're going to do nothing to insulate our economy from and our society from the possible meltdown of the bank. Carolyn Maloney, you ripped off consumers. Carolyn Maloney has her Overdraft Protection Act, which would protect consumers. You have substantial lobbying power, brilliant lobbyists who have represented you. Will you commit that they will be lobbying starting tomorrow for Carolyn Maloney's Overdraft Protection Act? Do you want to do something? Do you want to be on the right side of history? And this is not a trick question. I asked your predecessor's predecessor this almost a year ago today, and we told your people this was coming.
Congressman, we announced 2 new accounts recently. One that has no overdraft protection.
I didn't ask that. You're repeating exactly what your resigned predecessor said. Will you commit the lobbying power of your bank to work for the Overdraft Protection Act? Yes or no?
Congressman, I will commit that we will support the types of accounts that we just announced.
But that does not mean that you will work for legislation pending designed to protect consumers from unreasonable overdraft protection or the phony ordering of the checks that clear on a particular day to disadvantage the consumer. Finally, will you enforce the arbitration provisions in your contracts, even as to the phony accounts where the consumer never signed them for that account?
Congressman, we were able to settle our sales practice matters.
So settled mostly. What about the ones that are still pending?
Where there's arbitration, we'll continue to pursue it, but it's something that we certainly will continue to look at.
But you'll bar people from court. I thank you.
The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukamar, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I want to spend some time with regards to the interim report that Republicans have put together and try and go back and get some give and take and back and forth on this, Mr. Scharf. You know, this is the 3rd report that we've done. Our side has all done since 2016. And in fact, half the documents in here were obtained by Republicans now as a result of the fact that the Obama administration wouldn't turn them over. Now that the Trump administration is in charge, we actually can get documents into the CFPB and the other regulators that actually can have a better picture of what's going on here. So, you know, one of the things that it kind of concerns me is that as a former regulator, you know, we've got this is the first of 3 more meetings, which we've already had several prior to this on Wells, and yet we've not had a single report, a single hearing on the regulators who were asleep at the switch on this whole episode. In fact, in our report, it says in December 2013, the Los Angeles Times reported that the employees failed to meet their quotas and were going through all this sort of stuff, and that the CFPB supervisory staff was embedded in early 2014, and yet Wells Fargo had to notify the CFPB that the Los Angeles County city attorney was going to file a civil suit on the company's sales practices, and this was on May the 4th, and then finally on May the 8th, 6 months after the fact, the CFPB comes rolling in on their white horse and going to save the day. Director Cordway was asleep at the wheel again, and it's very unfortunate because this is a situation, when your predecessor, Mr. Stumpf, was in front of us, I asked the question, as a former regulator, I'm aware that the regulators live in your bank. I asked him the question, how many regulators are in your bank today? And at that point, he told me 75 were there full-time. Do you know off the top of your head how many regulators are in your bank full-time today, sir?
No, I don't, but it's significant.
Yeah. Would you say more than that or less than that, just as a...
I would guess more, but we can certainly get back to you on that.
Thank you. Well, it's very frustrating that to see that the CFPB had regulators sitting in your facilities, knowing this practice was going on, was told about it by the New York or the Los Angeles Times, broke a story, and yet 6 months later they finally take action. I think because of that, the situation continued to grow and went out of control, and now we're after the fact trying to find a way to stop the nonsense. One of the other questions I asked of your predecessor, Mr. Stumpf, when he was here, because at that time we had there was a situation where, even according to our own report here, it verifies that there was 1,000 people a year, roughly for 5 years, that were being fired for their actions and their involvement in this sales scheme situation. And I asked him at the time, as I recall, there was a third year that this had happened, and I asked him, I said, what is wrong with your culture in that here we have a situation where you fired people, not 1,000 people the first year. Okay, I understand you recognize your problem. Second year, another 1,000. I said, you're not fixing your culture. You're still firing people. Your culture's not fixed. How are you going to fix it? So finally, we have a new individual take over, and now we have you in his place. So I guess my question is, how are you going to change the culture that your predecessors never addressed, quite frankly? What are you doing different? How you see yourself going forward with your teams of people?
Well, I think certainly we have to be clear on how a series of things come together to form a culture, and then we as a senior leadership team need to make sure that we're behaving that way. So that includes changing compensation, the way we evaluate people, the things that we look at to include risk and customer experience as part of that evaluation. Anytime that we see any harm, we have to be the ones to deal with it as quickly as we can. If there's wrongdoing inside the company, don't just look at an individual and say that they did something wrong. Ask the question, do we have something in our structure that's wrong? And I think all those things come together, with accountability probably being the most important thing.
I just want to follow up in my remaining seconds here with something my colleague from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, talked about, and that is basically allowing the government to come in and change your business model. I'm very concerned about the attempts, especially on the other side of the aisle, to intimidate you and your board into changing your business model by doing or not doing business with certain industries. To me, this is something you as a board and as a leader of that company need to make, and don't allow the socialization of your business model by the government to take control of it. So with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. It's not intimidation. It's called standing up for the consumers.
Madam Chair, would you like to discuss this? I'd be happy to discuss this with you.
The gentlewoman from New York.
Operation Choke Point was the very same thing that we're talking about here today. If you want to deny that, you can, but that is the truth.
It is disrespectful.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, who is also the chair for the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Financial Institution, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I want to thank the chairwoman and Maxine Waters and the chair of the Oversight Committee, Mr. Green, for doing the work and the research that revealed a continuing pattern that has taken place at Wells Fargo for over this period of time. And I think that to Mr. Scharf, that this is something that should be an opportunity, because if you look at the investigatory work that took place, admittedly most of it or all of it before your 4 months, it should give you further ideas of what needs to be done to fix Wells Fargo, to move forward. So I think that it would be an opportunity for you to look at it and to take it very seriously. For me, you know, coming in, anybody that was on the board or had anything to do, the way that you first show that you want to clean things up is you clean everybody out. Because anybody that's there that was part of the decision-making process while these procedures were going on do not have clean hands. They're dirty hands. And so that then continues to be there. So the only way you fix an organization in that regards, as far as I'm concerned, is you clean out. Now, I will, in full disclosure, let you know that I have had the ability at the time to work with you in your previous capacity at Bank of Mellon, for Bank of New York Mellon. For the life of me, I don't know why you took this job, because, you know, anybody that's there is got to be held accountable and look to see what are you going to do to improve all of the horrendous, and I've taken Mr. Sloan and others to task in a very, very strict way. And I do intend on taking, whether they resigned or not, these board of directors that were there, that were a part of the policies, I'm going to take them really to task tomorrow. So, but I do think that you should take this report very seriously and to heart, and to make the changes that are necessary. Now, I have been talking to you about some issues that have been very important to me and the subcommittee of which I sit on. Two of them. One is with MDIs. And there have been a series of hearings because MDIs, in my estimation, can come into communities where maybe the big banks shouldn't be because they don't want to be there. But as far as giving out mortgages and making sure that they are able to provide services to communities or local communities where banking deserts are now appearing. And so we've been trying to make sure that these community banks and MDIs, where they're underbanked and underserved financial institutions, get capital from some of the big banks. And we've had that discussion. I know you told me that you were going to go and you're going to discuss it and come back. So my first question to you is, have you had that discussion? And what, if anything, is Wells Fargo looking to do? Because I want all the big banks to come asking every one of them to figure out how we can do to put capital into some of these big banks. I mean, small community MDIs.
Congressman, we are going to do something about it and completely agree about the importance of the minority depository institutions. And as you said, they reach neighborhoods that we can't necessarily reach. And we have been focused historically on connections expertise, but it is more about capital, as we've learned. So we're going to commit to invest up to $50 million of capital directly into these institutions as either Tier 1 or total regulatory capital, still keep them in a position where they are still minority-owned, but provide the opportunity to those institutions.
I don't want to cut you off, but I just saw I'm down on time. And I want to go through that with you on a continuous basis, you know, because as what we have been talking about, we don't want the big banks to just give money to small churches. We want big, major investments. So I want to have a further dialogue and conversation with you in regards to that. The other piece, I got 20 seconds, I want to know about the CRA modernization, where Comptroller Outing said he's discounting 75% discount on CRA credit for mortgage loans that are sold off. To me, that's going to stop people from giving out mortgages. It doesn't encourage it. But I'd like to get an answer from you in writing later whether or not you think that is the appropriate thing and the way that the comptroller is looking to do with CRA modernization. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Heisinger, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I guess let me start out with a tone of unity. And I'll agree with my colleague and friend from New York, Mr. Meeks, when he said, I'm not sure why you would take this job. I would agree. This is, you know, it is, in all seriousness, this is a significant undertaking. I'm glad you are doing it, however, because We know that the United States, to remain competitive in the world stage, needs to have financial institutions that can handle these large international and national accounts and those kinds of things, but there are problems in the past. So, Mr. Scharf, I am interested in what changes to the consent order plan writing process have you made since you've taken over as CEO? And it's my understanding that none of the consent orders have received a non-objection. I think that's what the regulators specifically call it, instead of approval. They have objected to each of the consent orders, is my understanding, even those issued in 2016. So I'm curious, walk me through that process of how you are dealing with that now and maybe an update on that.
Congressman, we have changed our entire management approach to the consent orders. First of all, I personally am deeply involved in all of our control-related work, including all of the consent orders. Our new chief operating officer that we brought in from the outside, who has experience in dealing with issues like this at another bank that was going through a series of issues, is on board now, and those responsibilities sit directly under him. He is probably spending 90% of his time on these issues. Under him, there is a group of people dedicated to managing each of these individual consent orders alongside all of the people across the company to ensure that the work is getting done appropriately.
Can you identify what the biggest barriers to achieving those acceptable submissions under the consent orders are?
I think
or what you believe that the regulators may not have identified that, but maybe they have.
I think just the biggest issue for us is just making sure that everyone across the company, including those in the front line, understand that risk management, especially operational risk management, is everyone's job, and we need to educate them on what that means and how that fits into a seamless structure inside the company with the independence of the second line.
Has that been really the barrier for you to receive those non-objections from the regulators, or is there more to it?
Well, I can't speak to what happened before, although based upon the actions that I've taken, I think that there, as I said, there's a different sense of urgency, there's a different focus, we have different people with different disciplines, with different review processes in place. So we're fundamentally managing these differently. We've made clear that these are the priorities of the company above all else.
And you're updating then those consent orders or working with the regulators to get those in order?
We regularly talk to our regulators about them, yes.
Okay. Let me move on a little bit. You had touched on sort of everybody on the front lines needs to know what the new culture is. Could you describe how sales employees are incentivized, and does the company still use sales goals and those kinds of things?
We've changed all of the practices that led to the bad sales behavior, including those sales goals that led to that bad behavior. Today, our frontline bankers are paid based upon a series of criteria, none of which are sales goals. It's things such as customer experience. It is balances in the overall count, and things like that. So we do not have goals like that.
How do you measure the customer satisfaction?
Historically, we've used a third party to provide those, where they come in and do mystery shopping in the branches and then provide the feedback directly to the branch. Going forward, we're going to be moving towards a net promoter score where we actually do direct surveys of our own clients and get their feedback.
We've got about 45 seconds. I want to hit a couple of quick things. Could you talk about the board makeup? That was one of my questions from my colleague from New York was, cleaning house. What is cleaning house on your board look like so far?
I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I believe something like 70% of the board is new to the board since 2017, but I can get that for you.
What I heard was 14 out of the 16, but if you could confirm that would be helpful. So I see people behind you taking notes. That's good. And then at the end of the day, can you describe what cultural changes really fundamentally need to happen there?
Absolutely. I'm sorry.
Well, my time has expired, but I wanted to know what fundamental cultural changes you felt are necessary, and maybe we can follow up in writing, unless the chair is willing to give you 30 seconds.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay, who is also the chair for the Subcommittee on Housing, Community Development, and Insurance, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your testimony today, Mr. Scharf. Recently, the Student Borrower Protection Center, an organization founded by former CFPB student loan ombudsman Seth Frotman, released a report called Educational Redlining. The report found that borrowers taking out private student loans to attend community college may pay more than similarly situated borrowers seeking loans to attend a four-year institution. SBPC applied for student loan products with Wells Fargo and found that Wells will charge a student applying for a $10,000 loan to attend a community college $1,134 more than a similarly situated borrower seeking the same loan to attend a four-year college. Do you think that's fair?
Congressman, there's no room for discrimination in any of our lending businesses.
Or do you intend on changing the culture around?
Congressman, I will go back and look at the specifics around this because I'm not aware of it, but if we've done something wrong, we will go back and make it right, and we'll make sure that it's nothing like this is happening going forward anywhere.
And also, you, under your consent decrees, you have a policy that steers people who would otherwise qualify for prime mortgages into subprime mortgages, and apparently that's part of one of the consent orders. Are you aware of that?
No, I'm not, Congressman, but we'll certainly go back and look at it.
And then how would you make those people whole that applied through your bank and were then steered into higher cost loans? What do we do to correct that?
Congressman, if we've done something wrong, then it's our obligation to take the appropriate remediation, and specifically, that's something that I have to look at to understand what the right thing to do is.
Okay, would you assist by or help those borrowers by reimbursing them or resetting the loans at a more reasonable interest rate?
Congressman, of course, we would look at all of the circumstances around it and figure out what the right thing to do is for those customers.
Yeah, and I think your customers, as well as most of us on this committee, are looking for fairness for the people that come to your bank looking for help. I mean, do you agree?
I completely agree. If we've harmed people or if we have not treated people properly, we should take the appropriate remediation.
Getting into another area, do you know Wells Fargo's lending volume in the state of Missouri and southern Illinois, a region that I represent? Do you know the volume for minority and women-owned businesses?
No, I'm sorry, Congressman, I don't.
Could you get me that information and share it with the committee?
We'll certainly go back on that, yes.
And what kind of incentive programs are in place for Wells Fargo employees in your retail and private banking? And are the programs linked to pay for bonuses? And I'm talking about an incident that I recently read about in your bank.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
Well, the typical retail branch employees at Wells tends to be on the lower end of the pay scale compared with corporate and investment banking, but you do incentivize them for bringing in high dollar customers.
I'm sorry, yes, Congressman, we've changed the compensation plans of the people in our branches, our bankers, so that they are no longer paid on sales goals or anything like that. They're paid on customer experience and balance growth. as well as some other factors that I don't recall right now, but it's nothing relative to sales goals.
Yeah, how do we better address the culture of the bank that you treat all customers with some respect and dignity?
Well, we're moving the customer experience goal method of rewarding people to based upon what customer feedback directly is.
I see. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Scharf, thank you for taking the time to be able to be here. Just a little follow-up in terms of some of the sales goals. A lot of the reason that Mr. Sloan was here and now you're here was from the sales goals and some of the initiatives that were put in place with false accounts that were open. Can you maybe expand on that a little more so I can understand how customer experience, expanding some of those balances, how that's going to be rewarded, and how to be able to offset any further abuse?
Yes, Congressman. So we've changed the entire compensation plan, but even beyond the compensation plan, we've changed the management structure and the reporting, so that anything related to those sales goals which drove that kind of behavior and the management processes that went along with it are no longer there. So so the people who work in our branches, regardless of level, have a series of things that they use to judge their performance. The most important, which I think if you were to go around and ask folks in our branch, they would say it is customer experience. And today it is mystery shops that take place inside the branch. We're going to be moving towards direct customer feedback, which will be a part of that, because we do believe that if the customer is not happy inside of our institution, then that's obviously very bad for us.
And are you pretty confident that you have a reporting structure through the chain of command to make sure that that's going to be implemented properly?
Yes, I am, Congressman.
Okay, great. You know, in your first earnings call, you'd mentioned that you'd be introducing a new set of disciplines on how the overall company is going to be run. Could you outline what that new set of disciplines might look like and how they're different from the previous occupant in your seat?
Yes, Congressman. So we now have an operating committee that meets regularly every single week for 2 hours. We meet once a month for a full month. Everyone is expected to talk about what's going on in their businesses, how they're doing with any of the control issues that we're aware of, or if there's anything new that we should be aware of. We then hold, the CFO and I hold monthly business reviews that were not held in the past, where we meet with every business along with their senior folks, and we review their financial results, their risk controls, progress they're making on people, including the diversity component of that on a going forward basis. That added to that is a fulsome budget process, which is far more robust than something that we've had in the past, which becomes a mechanism for us to proactively discuss things and make decisions that prior to that were made in the individual businesses.
Okay. Thanks for that. I come from a rural area, and we have a lot of conversation in this committee in regards to urban impacts that are going on. Could you maybe highlight for us the importance of Wells Fargo? I think has a number of branches in my district, rural communities. Does that play a pretty important role in regards to CRA in terms of credit access for small businesses?
I think it's extremely important. I think it's not just important for numbers, but it does go, when we think about some of the things that Wells has done well and not done well, helping in underserved communities is something which has been a core of the company. So the branches that we have in the communities where we've been for a long time are very important to us. The investments that we do in affordable housing, the lending that we do in LMI neighborhoods is something which is core to who the company is and certainly will be going forward.
Okay. And would like to be able to give you the opportunity, you'd had a question earlier on some of the stress tests and whether or not regards to the coronavirus and other challenges that may come up, known or unknown, to our financial institutions, in terms to be able to maybe expand a little bit on whether or not you feel you're well capitalized and able to take that into consideration.
Right. The point that I was going to make is that when you look at the stress test that we went through, I believe it takes unemployment going to something like 10%, GDP going down 8%, real estate values dropping by a quarter, commercial real estate values dropping by a third, very, very significant. And so as part of the CCAR process, we have to be able to continue to maintain the ratios that were required in that event with the suggested capital actions. And then as an institution, we do our own stress scenarios, which lead us to make decisions in terms of how we want to run the company. We've always done that prudently. Again, with all the issues that Wells has done, we have been very well capitalized, and we will continue to be well capitalized.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Lady. Mr. Scharf, how are you?
Fine, thank you, Congressman.
Now, you know, our banking system is the heart and the soul of our financial system. And this hearing this morning, at its core, is about trust. It's about consumer trust. It's about Wells Fargo customers' trust. And what I want to ask you is this. Can the consumers, can the people in this country trust Wells Fargo now?
People can trust Wells Fargo to do the right thing, yes.
Well, then, why is it that you've had consent orders? You've had consent orders from the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. You've had consent orders from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. You've even had consent orders from the Federal Reserve. And to my information, you have not adequately answered those. Am I correct?
You are correct.
And may I ask you to explain why you have not responded?
Congressman, I've joined the company 4 months ago. I'm not in a position to explain what was done right and what was done wrong because I wasn't there. What I can tell you are the changes that we're making, which I think are different than existed prior to my arrival.
Well, I will tell you that this is important for you to really understand. You have a myriad of customers out there, one of which is me. I'm a customer of your bank and have had great experience with it. You have been a leader in my community with helping to get some of the hardest hit funding to help folks out there who are suffering from their mortgage. This committee worked hard to get that done. We all didn't agree and didn't vote for the first bailout. Obama got a little peeved with many of us. But we said, Mr. President, we love you. We want you to do good. But you can't just throw all this money up to the banks and not do something about the struggling homeowners who were the victims. And he said, go back and do something about it. We did, and we come up with about $2.8 billion. And we called it hardest hit, and Georgia's called home safe. So there are some good things that you all have done, but my issue with you is that you are on this in a new position. But it is important, once you get in a bad situation, in order to get out of that bad situation into a new situation, you have to know how you got into the bad situation in the first place. So for you not to respond to these consent orders is unacceptable. And I just want to urge you to do so. Now, I think that will be a good idea, because to have your new chief accountability officer, I think you've appointed one recently, didn't you? Wells Fargo, according to media reports, created a new role of chief accountability officer for the branch banking business. Are you aware of that? I mean, I would think you are, being the chief executive officer.
Yes, I am, Congressman.
Okay, why is it that you can't assign him to respond to these? See, if you don't respond to these consent orders that are being asked of you by the regulators, the banking regulators, then that trust factor that I mentioned at the very beginning gets weakened. Will you move to respond to those consent orders after this hearing?
Congressman, all of my energy and my management team's energy is decked against responding to them in a way that's acceptable to them, yes.
All right, thank you.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. When John Stumpf came here before this committee in 2016, not long after the first Wells Fargo scandal broke, it seemed like the only answer he had to our questions was simply, I don't know. I called on him to resign immediately for such lack of knowledge into his own company's practices. This was a slap in the face to all members of this committee, but more importantly, to the consumers that were taken advantage of because of his gross mismanagement. So Mr. Stumpf's answers were simply unacceptable. Fast forward to 2019, when the next CEO, Tim Sloan, came before us to testify, I was somewhat optimistic that he would be able to fix the root causes of the issues that allowed so many scandals to occur. He made it seem like there was great progress and institutional changes being made to ensure that these actions would never be able to go unnoticed again. This might be an even more offensive than his predecessor was. I don't know. Answers, since he was not taking the company's transgressions seriously when such damage was done to customers. Now, all that being said, on a more positive note, I'm glad to see that Wells Fargo bring you in as an outsider of the company to try to fix the mess that has been surrounding the bank over the past few years. It will not be an easy process. You've talked about that, regaining this committee's or your customers or the regulators' trust, but I hope that you will be able to get the bank moving back again in the right direction. So, Mr. Scharf, I know that you've had prior experience at BYN Mellon, J.P. Morgan, and many other financial institutions. So my first question would be, I wanted to know how the management structures differ between Wells Fargo and other firms where you have worked, and then give you the opportunity to once again go into detail about some changes you will institute at Wells Fargo moving forward.
So I think what we have today is more similar to what some of the other large, well-managed institutions have versus what we had in the past. What we had in the past was it was a federated model, but there was not enough representation at the senior management table of all the different businesses. So the discussions that were able to occur in terms of how the company was run, decisions that were getting made, the structure didn't encourage that to happen. Things today are very, very different than that. There is a clear understanding that we're going to run the company as one. We have business leaders in charge of the significant business that report directly to me, where we have the opportunity to question everything that goes on. There's an independent infrastructure around all of the risk and control work that needs to happen. People understand that that is independent and the level of responsibility and accountability that they have. Now, having said that, it's still early on. And so I do not think we're as well run as other firms yet. We've just implemented this, but everyone understands why it's better for the company and is supportive of it.
I think the fact that you can question is important. So I'm glad to hear that. The other side of the aisle has reiterated that they believe Wells Fargo is too big to manage and should be broken up. Now, I completely disagree, considering the other banks of similar sizes have been able to successfully cooperate when they have appropriate risk management structures in place. So I asked this same question to Mr. Sloan, and I'm curious to get your perspective on the issue. When former President Obama was questioned about breaking up big banks in a New York Times interview, he said, one of the things that I've consistently tried to remind myself during the course of my presidency is that the economy is not an abstraction. It is not something that you can just redesign and break up and put back together again without consequences. That's what President Obama said. Do you agree with the sentiment from the former president that breaking up the biggest banks is unrealistic?
I believe that the country benefits from the large banks, and that they can be run properly and they should be run properly.
All right. Now, I'm a Main Street guy. I'm a car dealer in Texas. 50 years, and I've owned this business for 50 years, as I said, and I know how important access to capital is for the company looking to grow and expand operations, and how important risk and reward is, and how important it is. So one of my questions would be to you, are you a capitalist or socialist?
I'm a capitalist.
Thank you. And since Wells Fargo is one of the largest small business leaders in the country, I'd like to know quickly what controls are in play to ensure that your small business clients like me are being treated fairly and not subjected to abusive sales goals or incentive programs.
Our small business franchise has the same controls over it today that the consumer franchises and our corporate franchises have. We have first-line risk management, which is far more robust than it was. First-line meaning it's part of the business. It's far more robust than it was at the time of the sales practice problems. And we have an independent risk function, which is separate from them, which has an independent reporting line up to the chair of the risk committee of our board.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, who is also the chair for the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, please allow me to thank the persons who have worked so hard to pull this report together, the staff. Madam Chair, they literally had to fight to get the many thousands of records that they have received. It was not easy. And the Republicans played no role in securing those records. They are simply playing catch up, and they're not doing a very good job. Now, Mr. Scharf, excuse me, we cannot allow the punishment for this level of fraud to simply become the cost of doing business. No one has gone to jail. It is true that the CEOs of the too big to fail banks have thus far been too big to jail. We must do more than simply pay the government a fine. Most of the frontline workers in these banks live paycheck to paycheck, while the banks have made profits in excess of $150 billion a year. $150 billion a year since the recession. In 2018, a bank CEO made 776 times the salary of a minimum wage worker. That CEO made approximately $24.2 million. I shall not mention his name, but I'm prepared to if I have to. I have visited with you. Thus far, you have been straight with me. And I do believe that out of adversity, there's opportunity. The greater the adversity, the greater the opportunity. You now have an opportunity to help us change not only the culture at your bank, but to change the culture across banking. Workers need a living wage. All workers in banks should have a living wage. Workers need stronger whistleblower protection. This is a part of the solution, not non-disclosure agreements that silence workers. If we had had stronger whistleblower protections, I do believe someone would have reported this circumstance and we wouldn't be sitting here today. We need to improve your mentor-protege standing. Black banks are going out of business. We have approximately 18 or 19 now, depending on who's counting and how you count. We need help. You're in a position to change this. You can change the course of destiny for minority institutions, MDIs. The lowest paid workers in banks are women and people of color. The highest paid, disproportionately in both cases, are white men. White men are doing well. People of color and women are not doing as well. We can change this. These are the kinds of issues that we refuse to confront because there's a danger associated with it. There's a culture that has developed that will punish you if you try to develop equity and equality. It will silence you. You can speak with a very loud voice. You were not a part of the transgressions that took place, but you can be a part, and I believe you really want to be a part of a solution that can change not only the culture at Wells, but the culture across banking. We need a Bill of Rights for the workers within the banks. We ought to have something that is posted, that is clear, concise, and conspicuous, unambiguous, that says to workers, you mean something not only to this institution, but to this country. Here are your rights. You have the right to report without fear of being somehow punished for your doing the right thing. So I'm going to ask that we meet again. Will you assure me that you'll meet with me again, sir?
Absolutely, Congressman.
And will you assure me that you will work with me to develop this Bill of Rights for workers? Will you assure me, sir?
I will absolutely work on a Bill of Rights that makes sense in Wells Fargo.
I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Laudermilk, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Scharf, thank you for being here. Thank you for the time that we've spent discussing your short time at Wells Fargo and your vision of how to correct these problems and move forward to make Wells Fargo organization and compliance and focused upon its customers. Before I get into my questions, though, I'd like to remind my colleagues, I heard something earlier that the Republicans took a hear no evil, see no evil stance on this. I want to remind that it was the Republicans in 2016, the first year I was on this committee, that began the investigation into Wells Fargo. And we obtained several hundreds, thousands of pages of documents. And this report that was submitted today is not the first, it's not the second, but it's the third report that was issued that was based on those documents and the thousands more that the Trump administration has released voluntarily in the last year. So this isn't something new. This isn't just something that's popped out of the woodwork. This is something that's been going on that we have given our utmost attention to. And through all that, it's been somewhat frustrating. I have been frustrated and concerned over specifically the lack of progress that we saw over that time, especially when it came to complying with the consent orders by the regulators. Now, from our meeting and from other information that I've received, I'm encouraged that the OCC has indicated under your short tenure that the bank has made progress toward complying with these consent orders. And so with this large of a committee, your short tenure, everyone knows the past, you're going to get the same questions repeated over and over again, so everybody can get their sound bites. So some of mine may be questions have been asked before, but I really want to kind of hone in on some of the details. And could you briefly describe specific actions you and your staff are taking from a risk management perspective to come into compliance with the 14 outstanding consent orders that the regulators have imposed?
For our, specifically the issues in risk management relate to operational risk and compliance. We've significantly increased the staffing, but more importantly than just the people is putting the right framework in place so that everyone across the company understands how we're going to run risk and understands what their role is ensuring that risk management is done properly in the organization. That framework makes it clear what everyone within a business has to do, what their level of responsibility is, how we were going to do that review work in the second line of defense independent of the business itself. That's the independent risk management function. And then we have our third line, which plays an extremely important role, which is internal audit, which takes a third independent look at everything that's done. That all and those levels of independence are extraordinarily important. But most importantly, the robustness of what we have in place not just the people that exist, but the processes and the documents that we're building create a very, very different control environment than existed historically at Wells.
Okay. Thank you. And you've stated this before, but as I'd like to ask it again, and as Mr. Scott, my colleague from Georgia, stated, I'm also a Wells Fargo customer, and I've always had good customer experience. Under your leadership, is meeting regulators' expectations and requirements as well as the needs of the customers be the top priority?
There's no question that that has to be the top priority, but I take it a step further inside the company, which is what I explain to people is we're not doing this just because the regulators want it. We're doing it because it's the right way to run a company. And so we need to do this because we believe it's right. And when we run the company that way, then the regulators will be fine with it.
Probably my final question based on time is you've talked about restructuring it from a more federalist type organization to a more streamlined, centralized organization. How did that decentralized organization contribute to this problem? And thus, how does centralizing it, how is that going to resolve it?
Yeah, Congressman, that structure didn't have the appropriate checks and balances that we have today. So business leaders control their own staff functions, they control their own risk functions, and everything else that went along with it. So there wasn't a consistent set of policies, there wasn't a consistent set of application of policies, and there wasn't the independent functions to come in and look and to say, we like and agree with what they're doing or we don't, and therefore you need to change it. That's what we have today, and that overrules what individual businesses want.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, who is also the chair for the Subcommittee on National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yesterday, 2 of your board members resigned. Your 2 predecessors testified before this committee and shortly thereafter resigned. Here you are, less than 6 months on the job, and you're sitting in that chair. Why in the world would you take this job?
So I appreciate the question, Congressman. You're the third person who's said that since we started, so I'm glad to be able to answer it. I genuinely believe that Wells Fargo is an important institution for this country. I really do. And just because the company has not been well run doesn't mean it can be well run. When I talk to customers of all sizes, from consumers to small businesses to middle market companies, when I look at some of the things we've done in communities, when I talk to our own people, I was in a branch yesterday, and we asked someone, why do you come to work every day? And I swear to God, she said, because I love this company. I love the opportunity that they've given me. And that clearly wasn't the entire culture of Wells Fargo, but it is an important part of what the culture is. And so in the context of doing what's right for our employees, doing what's right for all the people we do business in their communities, I believe that if we run the company properly, we've got the opportunity to benefit more than if we didn't do this well.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, for you to walk in there, you got to have something that most folk don't. But let me turn to an extremely difficult part of this hearing for me. I have the minority report from Senator Sherrod Brown, March 2020, which I'd like to enter to the record, Madam Chair.
Without objection, such is the order.
Here's what's troublesome. It's about one of the blog posts of one of the employees who was going, hate crimes, I'm quoting, hate crimes, hoaxes are about 3 times as prevalent as actual hate crimes, and I hate that I actually dignified their existence by quoting a statistic that recognizes them, unquote. And then, quote, fine, let's say that they called him the N-word. Would that make them racist or just blank holes? Looking for the most convenient way to get under his skin. This is a guy who worked at the CFPB, an appointed position at the CFPB, which for somebody like me with my skin color, that's insulting and also disheartening. I'm using this because there is a report that suggests that there is a back channel communication between Wells Fargo and CFPB. My final question is, first of all, is there this back channel, is it still in existence, to your knowledge?
I'm not aware of a back channel communication, no.
So, I mean, this is the first time you heard about this alleged back channel communication going between?
I read the report, Congressman. All the conversations I think that we have with the CFPB, to my knowledge, are open, on-the-record conversations directly with the regulator that everyone is supposed to be aware of who should be aware of it.
Okay, that's the answer that I'm looking for, because the person who made these statements is no longer there. But I am very concerned, very much concerned. I was here when we, I guess the chairwoman and I, maybe the only two people, members here who were here when the CFPB was created, and whether people who were not here choose to accept it or not, there was great pains taken to make sure that the CFPB was not politicized. I mean, all the way down to keeping Congress from getting involved in the funding of that department. And so, if you take a look at, you've already read the report, but I would advise everybody to read this report. It is chilling when they start quoting some of the people who were actually at the CFPB making decisions. Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairwoman. Scharf, thanks for being here. It's been a long tradition, an unfortunate tradition for the CEO of Wells Fargo to spend a disproportionate amount of time here in the nation's capital. And frankly, the federal government spends a lot of energy running all sorts of businesses that they probably have no business running. But Wells Fargo kind of proves that even with all sorts of regulations, all sorts of oversight, layer upon layer of redundancy, it feeds this narrative that we just need more regulation. And in spite of all the regulation, in spite of all the Dodd-Frank reforms and the state regulators and the federal regulators and the OCC and the FDIC and the Federal Reserve and all kinds of laws that make it illegal to do things that Wells Fargo's employees did, these bad things happened anyway. There are human beings in all sorts of other companies, but we don't believe they've happened to the scale these bad things have happened there. So what makes Wells Fargo so special? Now that you've been there, why could all this happen at Wells Fargo?
Congressman, I think your point is very fair. We did not have the appropriate controls in place. We didn't have the appropriate culture. We didn't have the right.
So the humans there just needed the other controls that other places had. What drove these people to do it? Was it just passive? You didn't have the controls there, or was it an affirmative push to do bad things?
No, I think certainly the controls should have caught it after the fact, but the initial problem was that the structure of the company was decentralized, the culture promoted these types of activities, and the culture was not one of accountability.
So for that reason, there's been a lot of culpability, at least financially, for Wells Fargo. How many fines in total have Wells Fargo paid as a consequence of these bad actions?
Congressman, I don't have that number right here.
Is it a couple $100 like a speeding ticket? Is it a couple $100 million, or is it a few billion?
It's billions.
Billions of dollars. Billions of dollars. And I think it's fair to say that if these culpabilities result in billions of dollars of fines, did some people lose their jobs?
Congressman, yes, many people have lost their jobs.
At the very top, CEOs, you're now the third, board members, bank managers, managers of departments, people that were supposed to manage risk. Lots of people have been held accountable in the sense that they lost jobs. Has anyone gone to jail?
Not that I'm aware of.
Does any of this rise to the level of a crime?
Congressman, when we settled with the Department of Justice, we stated a series of facts which included that individuals at the bank committed crimes.
So do you believe it's up to the Department of Justice to follow through and actually hold someone accountable?
Congressman, I think it's up to the Department of Justice to determine what they think is right and appropriate.
Well, all of America is looking for the Department of Justice to hold people accountable, and frankly, it's not just in banks. We're all wondering, when's somebody going to jail? Because there's been all sorts of abuse of trust in our country, and frankly, the government's violated a lot of it themselves. But Wells Fargo, you've taken some actions that are encouraging in a short time as CEO. And I think, when you look around by reputation, you come as somebody that you say, yeah, looks like the potential to really come in and change a very, very large organization. So one you created was a sales practice oversight management function. Could you describe what you envision for this new role and what policies you think need to be put in place at Wells Fargo to ensure employees are actually held accountable for their actions?
Yes, Congressman. We've, since our sales practice scandal, we have looked across the company at the different sales practices to ensure that we don't have the kind of behavior that existed in the company prior. One of the things that we wanted to ensure on a going forward basis was, as we continue to evolve as a company, that continued. So to centralize the responsibilities of sales practice oversight in one place under our Chief Operating Officer, where they set the standards, they monitor what's necessary on a consistent base across the company to ensure that even though something might not exist today, that we don't wake up and find out something exists in the future.
Thank you. I yield.
The committee stands in recess for 5 minutes. will come to order. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Scharf, I echo the concerns of my colleagues on this committee about the extensive shortcomings of Wells Fargo over a number of years past, and I do hope that you're as committed and as successful in turning your ship around as you have stated in your testimony. Now, I'd like to bring up the issue of dreamers. This is an issue that hits close to home. Last summer, Eduardo Pena, a dreamer, a DACA recipient from Illinois, filed suit because he was wrongly denied an auto loan by Wells Fargo because of his DACA status. I was glad to see some of the changes that Wells Fargo has decided to implement recently, including its plan to provide DACA recipients with access to credit products, including auto loans, education loans, and mortgages. I cannot emphasize enough how important this commitment is, and I hope that you work diligently to implement this new policy. But because a press release is one thing, but at the end of the day, a new policy that does not achieve results in the form of actual loans to actual DACA recipients can mean it's been a failure. And so can we have your assurance that you will track progress on this issue and that you will report periodically back to us on progress on providing credit to dreamers?
We'll absolutely track the progress, and we can certainly talk to you about how we should report back to you.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. This is an important issue to my constituents. Now, as you're no doubt aware, Banks Community Reinvestment Act exam ratings and findings are disclosed to the public after, I believe, a delay of a couple years. One measure that we are contemplating would be to require banks to disclose their consumer compliance rating and findings in the same way. Would you agree that this would be an effective method to limit consumer abuses?
Congressman, we certainly agree in accountability and ensuring that the regulators understand and have access to all information they need to draw those conclusions.
No, I'm referring to public. The public also has a need to understand which banks deal properly with their consumers and which have a different record.
Congressman, respectfully, I think that's a decision and a discussion between you and the regulators.
Okay, so you don't have an opinion on whether or not this might be a good idea, so you would not be opposed to it?
Congressman, honestly, I think given the condition that we're in and the work that we have to do, it's really not up to me to, that I'm not the best person to give advice. I'm focused on doing the work.
Well, you're also in the process of repairing an organization where, some of the incentives were wrong and some of the results were wrong. So you must have an opinion on whether this sort of thing, a little bit of public visibility towards findings that have shown an abuse of the consumer might be an incentive that might have improved behavior in the past and might improve behavior going forward.
Congressman, I think there are, like any other issue, there are pluses and minuses on this, and I think that it's really appropriate for you and the regulators to talk about what those are and come to a decision.
Okay, so we'll handle this without your input, I guess. Compensation incentives are really, to my mind, at the heart of getting corporate behavior right, and I was encouraged to hear that you've made some changes there. One of the pieces of legislation that's being considered in this hearing, H.R. 3885, does a number of things, but one of which is to put the executive bonus pool in a first loss position for any regulatory fines or penalties. And while I have lots of questions about the details and the mechanisms and the formulas involved in this piece of legislation, I was wondering if you have a reaction to how effective this might be in preventing in getting attention by top management towards consumer abuses.
Congressman, I think what we have to do, and will drive accountability inside the organization, is to ensure that when we judge people, we make sure that there's accountability in what we pay people. And that is what we're doing today.
Okay, so now, so that's I guess my next question, which I will be giving you to answer for the record, because there'll be some detailed numbers. Could you answer for the record how the financial burden for regulatory fines, you just go over the top 20 fines that happened over the last decade, and describe how they were the economic pain for those fines was distributed among the shareholders and top executives and everyone else who might have absorbed the pain, both as they occurred in the last decade and how they would occur with the current system that you now have in place.
Congressman, I can tell you that the fines that we have incurred over the past year when I was at the company have impacted people's compensation directly.
Right, so I'd like to see a table of numbers and percentages to see what fraction of the burden lands on the shareholders, what lands on top management, on line management, and so on down there. And I think I am now out of time and yield back the balance. We'll be giving you a question for the record on that.
The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Scharf, for appearing today. I've heard a number of people ask you today why you would take the job that you've taken, and I frankly appreciate you stepping into the role. But with that said, today, how would you characterize the reputation and the brand of Wells Fargo today as we sit?
I think as we sit here today, we have not yet re-earned the trust that we would like the Wells Fargo name to represent.
In your opinion, is the brand and the reputation of Wells Fargo, is it irreparably damaged?
Congressman, I do think that the brand and reputation is extraordinarily important in this business and something that we have to work to earn, and we in fact can do that.
You can restore it, or the Wells Fargo can restore its brand and reputation.
Congressman, I absolutely believe that we can restore the brand and reputation of Wells Fargo by taking the kinds of actions that we've started to take in the short time I've been at the company.
In my district, you have a number of retail institutions. You've got a number of branches in my district. If the customer is a hourly wage employee, if it's a small business person, a professional, and they come in and they want to do business with Wells Fargo in layman's terms, how would you instruct your bank officer, customer service representative, whoever's trying to get that business or maintain the business, what would you tell your employee to relate to this hourly wage employee, to the small business owner, somebody trying to take out a mortgage? Why should they want to do business with Wells Fargo?
Congressman, I think we should treat our customers and our employees the way we would want to be treated. And so to the extent that we are thinking about their needs and what's right for them and how the things that we can do can be there to serve them, that is the way we want all of the people who work for Wells Fargo to be thinking about how to deal with their customers that walk in the door. If we're not doing that, I genuinely believe we're not going to be successful. We clearly haven't done that historically at all times, and we've seen the results of that. And so that has something which has to be built into the culture of the company, the compensation of the company, the management of the company, in a very different way than it has been in the past.
Well, let me ask it in a different way. What would that bank officer tell that customer that they're trying to either maintain or obtain? What would they tell them about Wells Fargo and why they should want to do business with Wells Fargo, considering everything that customer or potential customer has seen and read about in the media?
Congressman, I think that we want our customers to know that we're committed to doing the right thing for them. And all the actions that we're taking since I've been at the company, it is directed towards that. Ultimately, that's what's going to earn back the trust of the people who stand in judgment of us. And that's not just our customers, it's the communities we serve and regulators and shareholders and legislators. And so if we're not doing the right thing for our customers every single day, then we're going to fall short of who we should be.
Right, I'm the bank customer. I say, I'm thinking about cutting my relations with Wells Fargo because of everything that I've heard about, I've read about, that's been going on for several years. Mr. Wells Fargo and Ms. Wells Fargo, why do I stay as your customer? Well, in layman's terms, what would that person say to
Well, I think the number one reason why they would say is they love the people that they do business with that work at Wells Fargo. The personal relationships that they've developed is extraordinary. I was in a branch yesterday in Washington. We asked that very question. Why do your customers come in? And it's because of that personal connection, and then because they believe that what we do is great for them. Our products, our services, our convenience, our technology, but ultimately it's got to have this wrapper of we're going to do what's right by them.
Thank you, Mr. Scharf. My time is expiring. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Chairman Green, for your steadfast oversight. I also want to recognize the diligent and good work of this committee's oversight and investigations staff. In 2018, large banks posted record profits that were only topped by their profits in 2019. But a decade ago, these same banks were rescued by trillions in bailout loans. It does seem that in the case of banking, your profits are private while your losses are socialized. Over the years, you've helped lead Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, BNY Mellon, and now Wells Fargo, 4 of the 9 recipients of the initial round of TARP rescue funds. And Mr. Scharf, this is your second time appearing before the committee in less than a year. Given that this report shows the limits of traditional confidential bank supervision in effectively curbing Wells Fargo's egregious behavior, do you agree that the public has a right to hear from you directly through annual testimony and reporting?
Congresswoman, when I took this job, I understood that this was part of what the job is. What the appropriate frequency is, I will leave it to you to make that determination.
It is a reasonable ask for other large, systemically important U.S. banks. Yes or no, just for the record?
Congresswoman, I'm not the right person to ask that question. I'm focused on Wells Fargo right now.
And so yes or no, do you agree that it's fair that you should come annually and report?
Congresswoman, I do believe that it's appropriate for me to come when asked to come by the committee.
So Congress established your national charter. Congress created the deposit insurance your bank enjoys. Congress stood up the Federal Reserve to be a lender of last resort, and Congress developed the legal framework that governs your bank. So an annual check-in is not too much to ask, and that is exactly why, with the support of the AFL-CIO and the Communication Workers of America, I introduced the Greater Supervision in Banking Act, requiring annual public testimony of GSIB CEOs like yourself and reporting about bank size, diversity, any regulatory enforcement or fines, and notably the workforce's treatment at all levels. Your contract with Wells specifically states you will not be required to relocate, allowing you to work remotely. However, while at BNY Mellon, you push to restrict employees' ability to telecommute. So yes or no, just in the interest of time here, have you instituted similarly restrictive policies at Wells?
Congresswoman, first of all, I do not telecommute. That's a very important distinction. We are a national company that has people all across the country, including our operating committee, and I'm in a location with a series of our operating committee members.
Mr. Scharf, I just want to get back to the employees here. Have you instituted any restrictive policies at Wells?
Congressman, I have not implemented any restrictive policies at Wells.
In the midst of this global pandemic, will you commit to allowing all employees who can perform their duties remotely to do so? Yes or no?
Yes.
Do you commit to providing all workers, down to custodial staff, call center employees, and third-party contractors with necessary sick days as well as paid leave? Yes or no?
I need to think about that whole list of people, but for our employees, we absolutely will do that.
All employees, down to custodial staff, third-party service workers, our most vulnerable
I did not
workforce.
say third-party workers. I said employees.
No, I did.
Right, I said employees, Congresswoman. Okay. And I said we certainly would be willing to look at the rest. It's not something I've thought of sitting here.
Okay, well, I hope you'll give a deep thought because they do represent our most vulnerable workforce. I want to be clear, being a nationally chartered bank and one of the largest at that is a privilege. It is not a right. It is a privilege that comes with accountability to this Congress, your employees, and the American public. When all Americans, not just those that are Wells customers, serve as a backstop to your bank, again, the least you can do is show up once a year to answer these questions thoughtfully. Thank you, and I yield.
The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Scharf, for your testimony. When I read through the reports, I kind of bucket the issues in three places. 1, ops/compliance, 2, reporting, and then 3, BOD issues, Board of Director issues. I want to kind of hit on each of these quickly. So on the ops/compliance side, you've talked about how you've flattened the organization, no longer in the federated structure. Part of the federated structure was risk management was embedded in the individual business units, I believe. Specifically, has that practice ended? Have we elevated risk management and sort of pulled it away to monitor more broadly?
Congressman, we have to have independent risk management, and we've completed that at the company, and we're continuing to build out all of the appropriate first-line functions, as well as we work to make that second-line function as effective as it needs to be.
And then another issue on that was mentioned, this enterprise-wide risk management component. I realize that probably looks different at each bank. How are we progressing on that specifically?
We're continuing to work to make sure that everyone in the company understands what their responsibility is. The only way we can have an effective risk management infrastructure across the company is that there's consistency of application, a consistent level of understanding and implementation. And so that takes some time, and that's working through.
Right. And then on the reporting side, again, it was clear that the board felt, the board had all kinds of faults, obviously, but they felt at times that they weren't getting the right information or that they were being misled. Obviously, they don't prepare reports, they consume reports that management provides them. How confident are you that the reporting issues, the accuracy, the frequency, et cetera, have been taken care of going forward?
I certainly think Congressman, the quality of the reports we give them has to continue to improve. I think that's an ongoing task that we have to make sure we're doing our very best at. Board members generally, it can be very often as good as the quality of the materials we give them.
Yep.
And so that is an ongoing effort that is underway and have to continue to improve at.
Thank you. And then with respect to the board, I want to ask a general question because we're going to have 2 former members of your board here tomorrow. And I think that sets a very interesting precedent that I hope doesn't become routine where we're hauling in board members of companies. Now, your situation's unique, so I hope that this is in fact unique. High level, what is the role of a board of directors in a public company?
The board's responsibility is to oversee management, to approve strategy, and certainly in our case to have the confidence in the regulatory work that's ongoing.
Not to run the bank.
Congressman, no, I believe the management team is tasked with running the bank, overseen by the board.
Thank you. And then how important is it for you to be able to have proprietary conversations with your board?
Congressman, I think it's extremely important. I personally believe that the best way to help the board members do their job and for the company to get what it can out of every single board member is to be as open and honest as you possibly can. Think very, very early on about having conversations with them so they can be brought in very early. And doing that in a confidential way, I think, is critical.
Yeah, and I think I'm sort of caught in 2 minds here. I think if I were a shareholder of Wells, I'd be happy with the outcome of new board members. As a member of Congress, again, I worry that we're going to set a precedent where we haul board members in for any company that's not doing things exactly how we want. I think that sets a dangerous precedent. I don't know that we've done that. I think we did it with Enron a while back. Again, a unique situation which feels appropriate. I want to switch to something, hopefully we can get through it. Do you have any immediate plans to run for Congress?
No, I don't, Congressman.
Good job. Do you seek to become a legislator at any point?
No, I don't, Congressman.
Do you like running your bank? Do you like running banks?
Congressman, I'm very proud and I do enjoy running the bank.
So I'm going to urge you to run your bank. Run your bank according to the laws of this country. We're the legislators. I don't want to run your bank. I don't think you want any of us running your bank. I don't think you want us telling you who to do business with, what to do, how to operate, all those sorts of things. You run the bank consistent with the consent orders and the laws of this country. We will create the laws. It's a beautiful system. If we start mucking it up, by telling you who you can and can't do business with, I think we set a very terrible precedent once again. And with that, I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Iowa, Ms. Ackney, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you, Mr. Scharf, for being here today. Appreciate it. My colleagues have already addressed most of them, so I know you're new to the bank, and I'm not going to rehash most of the issues that Wells Fargo has had. But everything I've been hearing so far and talking with you individually as well sounds like things are improving, and I really hope that that continues, because I think all of us here expect better than what we've seen from Wells Fargo and from your predecessors. My interest in Wells Fargo doing better, as you're probably aware, is very acute to the fact that we employ almost 15,000 people in my district, so thank you for that. We have a vested interest in making sure that Wells Fargo is a successful bank to keep those jobs. Can you give me some assurances that fixing the previous problems will be your top priority, and that you're going to work to ensure that any future plans aren't creating the kinds of risks that were so poorly monitored before?
Congressman, there's no question in my mind, there's no question in our board's mind. I don't think there's a question in the employees of Wells Fargo's mind or our shareholders at this point that our #1 priority is to fix these issues. I have said it internally. I've written it internally multiple times. I've talked about it on our quarterly earnings call, where they have called for specifics relative to strategy and growth and other things like that. And I've said I'm not in a position to give you information on that. I am focused on fixing these issues that we have, which are these regulatory problems and the underlying control infrastructure work, and that has to come before everything. So I deeply believe that, and I've told everyone who is associated with the company that that's the case. And I think given the work that we have to get done, that's totally appropriate. I'm sorry, your second question?
No, thank you. You answered that question exactly the way that I would like you to answer that question, and we'll be, obviously, as you're fully aware, making sure that we're on top of that, and I appreciate you bringing that up. As the leader of the company, it's important for you to be making sure that that message is being pushed down all the way through the ranks and allowing for those folks who are the frontline jobs to be able to push up to management as well to ensure that there's a good culture. So thank you so much, because representing those employees and providing a voice for them truly is one of my biggest responsibilities out here. And I was really happy to see that Wells just announced its increase to its minimum wage. That said, I do want to ask you, will you continue to look for ways that ensure all of your employees are paid a living wage and put more money in their pockets, and what might be some of those things you're doing?
Yes, Congresswoman, we absolutely have to continue to look for ways to help our employees, especially the lower paid employees. When I got there and we looked at this issue, we did think it was appropriate to look at the cost of living in different parts of the country so that we could represent to ourselves that we were thinking about what that living wage looks like. And so differentiating and paying $20 an hour in the highest cost locations is, we think, very appropriate, and scaling it based upon that cost of living also seemed to make sense. As we go forward, that's something we should continue to look at. That's not something that we do once that just is set in stone. We need to make sure that we're being as conscious of that cost of living as we possibly can. We also have to look at the health care benefits. This past year, when we set premiums and put money into people's HSAs, the majority of the lower paid people, if not all of the lower paid people, didn't see any increase, and many saw a decrease. And that's something else. That was done before I got there, but that's something that as we go through the process this year, we're going to take a look at and say, are we sharing health care costs appropriately across the company? And then certainly giving people an opportunity inside the company is extraordinarily important. Whether it's within a location so that people can continue to grow, take on more responsibility and earn more money as time goes on, or do something in a different part of the bank, is something that should be core to what our employees think of when they think of Wells.
I appreciate that. Now, last year I asked Mr. Loan in front of this committee about Wells Fargo's announcement to lay off 400 people in Des Moines and whether those jobs were going to be moved overseas. To make matters worse, although those workers were found to be eligible for retraining and other help, that certification didn't come until just 2 months ago. So way too late to be of much use to a lot of those folks. Wells Fargo has always been an American bank. It still gets a significant majority of its revenue from the U.S., and my priority will be to those people who work at Wells Fargo. Will you commit to fully considering where Wells has built its business and what it's going to do to make sure that we don't move jobs overseas?
Congressman, we would like to keep as many jobs in the U.S. as possible, and we will commit to retraining, offering retraining to anyone who winds up in a situation where we have to make a change in their location.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters and Ranking Member McHenry, and thank you, Mr. Scharf, for being here today. I want to, I guess, contrary to some of my colleagues, I want to applaud you for taking on this role. I note that it's a challenge, but with great risk comes great reward, and I applaud you for having the courage to step up to the plate and to hopefully rebuild one of our great American institutions. In many ways, you are here today to not only answer about your plans moving forward with Wells Fargo, but fair or not, you are also here to answer for the mistakes of your predecessors. Mr. Scharf, I understand you have led an intense review of the bank since you became the CEO in October of last year, and to some extent I know you've already addressed this, but could you discuss again what you learned from this review in terms of the culture at Wells Fargo and risk management and other related issues?
Congressman, I have had the opportunity to talk to so many of the employees at Wells Fargo who I have found to be extremely open and forthcoming of their opinions of what we as a company and what the management team has done right and has done wrong. They recognize that the problems that we have are extraordinarily significant, and they look at management and they say, you all need to do something very differently than you've done. So as we think about the work that we need to do, it is around culture, it's around structure, it's around people and jobs, and probably most importantly, because it sets the tone for so many things, it is about accountability, both for people staying in jobs, but also whether we're appropriately impacting them for both the good and the bad that they've done inside the company. And there are actions that we're taking on every one of those items to ensure that the company is run differently than it has been in the past.
Thank you. One thing we have learned since 2016 is that Wells Fargo's leadership then repeatedly provided incomplete information to the public. As the Republican staff report finds, evidence showed that former CEO Tim Sloan and his team provided incomplete and exceedingly optimistic information to Congress, the public, and the board of directors at Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo was no closer to complying with the regulators' consent orders when Tim Sloan resigned in March of 2019 than when his team took over in 2016. For better or for worse, the financial services industry has been under a microscope since the financial crisis. And whenever a major bank like Wells Fargo fails to uphold its duty to their shareholders, their customers, the public, and their regulators, it reflects poorly on the entire industry. And when that happens, some of my colleagues here on this committee claim that the bank is too big to manage and the financial services industry as a whole is rife with abuse. That is not the case. So the burden falls on you, Mr. Scharf, and Wells Fargo at large to prove to us and to your regulators that Wells Fargo is a changed institution. Mr. Scharf, we've talked a lot today about the changes the bank is making under your leadership to strengthen the bank going forward. As I've listened to you talking, I'm reminded of an old quote that I've heard many times as a young man growing up, that trust takes years to build, seconds to break, and forever to rebuild. So I ask you, what are you doing? What is Wells Fargo doing to not only earn back the trust of your customers, but also that of this Congress?
Congressman, we need to run the company fundamentally differently than we've run it in the past. And my approach, both here at Congress, with our employees, with everyone outside the company, is to be completely open, forthright, and honest. I'm not trying to paint a picture which is better or worse than anything I see, because you and others will find out. I live my life as simply as I can. That to tell, there's one story, it's what I believe, and if I find out that I'm wrong, then I'll deal with that and change the course. So what you're hearing from me is exactly what I think. I'm not trying to minimize the work that's necessary. It is a lot of work. There's no question about that. But I do believe, based upon what I've seen at other institutions and the issues that we have, that we can run the bank in a way which will earn back the trust and respect of all those outside of our company.
There, of course, is tremendous work left to be done from a reputational standpoint, and I hope you will commit to being transparent with Congress, your regulators, and the public every step of the way.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Virginia, Mrs. Wexton, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Scharf, for joining us here today. Mr. Scharf, have you had the opportunity to review the House Majority Staff's report?
Congressman, yes, I have.
Okay, and it's entitled "The Real Wells Fargo Board and Management Failures, Consumer Abuses, and Ineffective Regulatory Oversight." Is that correct?
I believe so.
Now, you know that in this report, they cited the July 2019 OCC report of examination, which concluded that the OCC had not observed a drive toward greater consistency, and a large number of plans had to be submitted multiple times to the OCC. You do acknowledge that, right?
Yes, Congresswoman.
And that the OCC remains concerned about the overarching vision around remediation.
Yes, Congresswoman.
Okay. And you also then are aware that the report concluded that Wells Fargo's board abdicated its responsibility to oversee the bank's compliance with the 2016 sales practices consent orders.
Yes, I am aware that's what the report said.
Do you agree that the board did not provide robust oversight of those consent orders?
Congresswoman, what I could talk to is what I've seen of the board since I've joined.
Okay.
I wasn't there.
Well, that's fine. We'll just focus on being forward-looking.
And what I...
Because as a result of this report, well, I don't know if it's a result of this report, but right after this report was released, two of your directors resigned yesterday. Is that correct?
They did resign Sunday, I believe.
Sunday, okay.
Yesterday morning.
Okay. And you also said in response to an earlier question that 70% of your board was new. Is that correct?
I said I believe that's approximately the number.
So there's been a lot of turnover in the board since you took office.
Yes, there has been.
And
excuse me, I'm sorry, can I correct myself? Since I've joined the board, we've had one new board member join.
Okay. And as CEO, you serve on the board of directors, correct?
Yes, I do.
And do you have a role in selecting new members, in recruiting and selecting new members for the board of directors?
Our directors are selected first by our governance and nominating committee, which I'm not a member of, and then they're voted upon by the full board. So I would be aware of it, I would be part of a conversation, but I don't have the responsibility to do that.
Okay, but you believe that the board's role is to provide oversight of the directors and the company, of the executives and the company, is that correct?
Yes, I do.
All right, and when looking for somebody to serve on the board, are you looking for somebody who can credibly challenge you? Would that be something that you would look for?
Congresswoman, again, I'd be speaking just for myself,
For yourself,
not
yes.
for the entire board. I think as a board, we absolutely need people who are going to challenge us, who come from different places, have different backgrounds, have different kinds of diversity, and that people with that diversity of background should help us get to the best conclusion.
So the reason I ask is because Warren Buffett just sent out his annual letter to shareholders just very recently, and in there he talked about the fact that corporate chiefs rarely bring in outside advisors who provide dissenting opinions, and that as a result, when seeking directors, CEOs don't look for pit bulls, it's the Cocker Spaniel that gets taken home. So for you, in your decision, when you cast that vote for who's going to replace those the two members of the board of directors who resigned, will you commit to look for a pit bull and not a Cocker Spaniel?
Congressman, I absolutely want someone who's going to speak up, going to speak their mind, that understands things that I don't understand and adds to the conversation. There's no question that I think boards are better off for having people like that.
And pushes back on behalf of shareholders and other folks and account holders?
Congressman, I absolutely believe that boards have to be independent and push back whenever appropriate on the management team.
Thank you very much. I'll yield back.
The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you again, Mr. Scharf, for being here today. So who knew 33 years ago as a teenager in Advance, North Carolina, opening my very first checking account with my dad taking me there, that it would be at First Union National Bank, later to be part of Wachovia, and then later Wells Fargo, and who also knew that that would be right next to my congressional office. So this bank it's important to me, not just really for those sentimental reasons, but because it's important to my constituents and the thousands and thousands of families there in my district, and it's also important because it's important to our economy. I want to, again, thank you for time to meet a few months ago with my staff and to talk about what you're bringing to Wells Fargo. And I want to commend you, from what I understand, on your fierce commitment to fixing the wrongs of your predecessors. It's not an easy matter to deal with, but I have no doubt in my mind that you're the right person for the job. So, Mr. Scharf, in your day one letter to Wells Fargo employees, you stated this: "The seriousness of what we do brings tremendous responsibility. To that end, our top priority is to run the company with the highest standards of operational excellence and integrity. Risk, control, and compliance are the price of admission and will always be the highest priority. We cannot serve our customers in the manner they and all other stakeholders expect of us if we do not operate the company to these standards." So my question, can you please elaborate more on some of the new standards you're putting in place at Wells and how that will reshape the culture of the institution for the betterment of the consumers?
Thank you, Congressman. I do think it is extraordinarily important that there is clarity inside the organization of what's expected. That starts with the management team and the responsibility and accountability that we take for either driving the success or the failures across the organization. We've dramatically changed both the compensation and the performance management review system for our senior folks. I think if you look back historically at how we paid people, there was not the accountability that most people would expect given the results that we've had. When we look at what we're doing going forward, I think you'll see a meaningful change in that. We carve out a specific piece of the individual's performance, the company performance, which we're very honest about, and then we say, what are you doing in order to do the appropriate risk and control work? That, to the extent people aren't doing that, and that includes the remediation on these consent orders, that can only be a takeaway, because as you talked about in my note, I believe it's a price of admission. That sends a very powerful signal through the organization in a way that didn't exist before. And I don't want to take up all your time by just going on about that one question. But I think if I had to say one thing which I think will set the tone inside the company, which is extremely different, I think that ranks towards the top.
Very good, thank you. So a little more on incentives. So it's now been several years since the bank's unauthorized scandal came to light. In that case, it was clear the bank's sales culture was one of the root causes, and the bank has admitted as much. So your predecessors ultimately failed to change the sales culture of the bank in an impactful way. How can you ensure that the cultural shift that you're implementing at the bank will have a lasting and meaningful impact? Now, I get what you were saying earlier, thank you, but how do we know that this is going to last and be meaningful?
Congressman, I do agree that we have to ensure that we don't just fix this problem once, but we fix it everywhere inside the institution, and we have a systematic process to ensure it doesn't happen again. So in addition to all of the risk management controls that we've spoken about that now are being built out across the whole company, we've just added a new role called our Sales Practice Oversight Officer, which looks independently at all of our sales practices across the entire company is responsible for ensuring that we do not have any gaps in our practices and ensures that they all operate in a manner which represents the way we want the company to be run in the future. That is not just looking and approving at the plans, but it's ensuring that the right reporting exists and the right management processes exist to support the kind of behavior that we know we need at Wells Fargo.
Just as quickly as possible, it's no secret that regulators were asleep at the switch when the bank was tied up with the scandal. What measures are you taking to ensure that all current and future practices are above board with regulations? And it seems that I'm out of time if he would have a chance to answer that.
The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Scharf, for being here. And like many of my colleagues here, I really do wish you well. Wells Fargo needs powerful leadership to right the ship and to correct the wrongs of the past. We've had a lot of conversation today about governance, about culture, about what's going on presently, a review of those systems and leadership moving forward. What I'd like to focus on is the people left in its wake, the harms that have been done. As important as it is that you right the ship moving forward, I believe everyone who has been harmed by Wells Fargo is entitled to remedies, full return of their damages. We know from the OCC reports, I'll read just a part of it from the majority report, page 63, that 1 year after setting up a center of excellence, customer center of excellence, OCC found that the bank's remediation program is critical to the organization as the current approach to remediation is inefficient, inconsistent, often lacks appropriate accountability, and takes far too long. I'm going to use one simple example because I think personal stories often do it. In 2017, Samir Hanif had his car repossessed. It was under a loan from Wells Fargo. I think unbeknownst to him or duplicating to him was insurance sold, car insurance that he did not need, driving him into delinquency on the car. After paying hundreds of dollars to get the car back, he found that the greater harm to him was his credit score. He'd lost 100 points on his credit score as a result of the corrupt, fraudulent practices of Wells Fargo. That's one case. So my question is, in your own analysis, has your company done a full look back on every single person who was harmed, whether it's the 3.5 million fake accounts, the fraudulent sale of car insurance, the wrongful disclosures, which your predecessor said came as a result of a computer glitch, years and years long computer glitch, the taking of people's homes improperly, the failure to modify mortgages improperly, lost houses, lost cars, lost credit worthiness. How many people have been harmed, and are you looking individual by individual to know their damages and get them compensation?
Congresswoman, I share your both the passion as well as the frustration. When we look at the things that we have done and the mistakes that we've made, it's one thing to say that we've made mistakes and we'll make them better going forward, but we have to do the right remediation work. There's no question that in my mind that we need to move faster and we need to be as complete as we possibly can in the thinking. We have a significant number of people working on this. But with myself coming into the company, a new chief operating officer coming to the company, we want to take a fresh look at what that actually means. And so
that's what I'm asking you. What have you commanded your team to do in terms of we're talking millions of customers. Right. What have you commanded that they do in terms of looking at the harm? And I hate the word remediation. That sounds like something that you do out in a yard when there's a spill. This is damages to human beings. This is customers who have suffered harms. What are you doing to identify the harm and compensating them for that harm?
What I have directed our people to do is to take a fresh look at every one of the instances where we've harmed consumers and to ask the question, Have we sized the answer properly? And what can we do to make sure that the work is done much more quickly than it has been to date?
Let me contrast what your predecessor said. For example, on mortgage foreclosures, he said that they took a look, and where they had made some mistakes, they sent $15,000 checks to people. And if they heard nothing back, they thought that was probably satisfactory. Is that your approach?
Our approach is to make sure that everyone who is harmed gets compensated properly. And
how do you calculate that? That's what I want to know.
We can, Congressman, I think we'd be glad to take that offline and talk about some examples of what that is piece by piece.
I'd love to know that, but in a global way, so each and every person gets compensated. Thank you very much, and I wish you well with your work. I sincerely do.
Thank you. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gooden, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, are you ready? I'm going to yield my time to Mr. Stile. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gooden. Thank you, Mr. Scharf, for being here today. Wells Fargo needs strong ethical leadership to turn the tide. The board thinks you're the person. I think time will tell. But I appreciate you being here today to talk about what you're doing. Your day one letter to Wells Fargo employees that you wrote, your firm needs to be doing the following. Set clear priorities and execute, execute, execute. Words are nice, but actions are what matter. Priorities, strategies, and ideas are useless without clear execution. I want to talk to you today about the priorities and about your execution at your leadership at Wells Fargo. Can you walk through what your priorities are that have been set and the status of those priorities? What are the most important priorities? And what needs to be achieved to fix Wells Fargo and restore the public trust? And importantly, what's actually been achieved and what has not yet been achieved? And for those that are unresolved, what's getting in the way of that successful execution?
Congressman, I think the most important thing that I did when I arrived at the company, when I talked about setting the clear priorities, is making sure that everyone understands that our first priority by far is to do all of the regulatory work that's required. We need to do it both because our regulators have asked us, but also because it is the right thing to do to build the proper foundation. It wasn't clear to me inside the company that everyone understood that. And when we looked at the activities that people were spending their time on and where we were investing our money, it equally wasn't clear to me. So setting that as a priority, and then as we go through our budgeting exercises and business reviews, asking the questions, are we doing everything that we should and putting the appropriate resources towards these activities, you wind up with a different answer, I think, than we had last time. The way we go about managing these activities, I think today is very, very different. So the amount of time that I'm spending on these activities is 70 to 80% of my time. We brought in a new chief operating officer, under which all of the responsibility for driving the work across the company on the remediation now sits. He's probably spending 90% of his time on these activities. We as a company are working together differently than we worked together before. And so the priority, the process, the people, and then if I were to dig down and talk about each of the individual consent orders and how we're going about thinking about doing the work, it's a far more professionally managed set of circumstances than it was when I got there. This is just setting the framework for doing the work. And I remind everyone internally all the time that what we've done is we have put in place our ability to get the work done, but we have to go do it piece by piece. It's a lot. It's going to take a period of time. I've not committed to that period of time because I'm not sure what it is yet. But we will stay as focused as we have to ensure that we get to the finish line on it.
Thank you. To follow up a bit, and a lot of my colleagues here have discussed concerns about the culture at Wells Fargo when you arrived, and it's well documented, some of those abuses. Can you just touch on some of the recruitment efforts, in particular at the senior staff level, that played into Wells Fargo's efforts to change that corporate culture?
Sure. I think you know, I think one of the problems that we had across the company is we didn't always put the right people in the right jobs. I said that in my opening remarks. The culture of the company was more family-like, and family can be good, but family can be bad. Making the tough decisions about who really is capable and who's not capable, who's performing and who's not performing, is extremely important at all levels in an organization, and I don't think we had done that as well as we could. So if people don't have the right skills or don't have the right experience for things that we need to get people that do, as long as we treat people with the utmost respect. So when we look at the people that we've brought in from the outside or people that we've promoted up from in, I think people both inside and outside the company say that they fit the bill. They've got the experience, they've got the know-how, they've got the proven ability to get work done. And so again, we're set up with the right infrastructure now to get the work done in a way that we weren't 4 months ago.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you being here and we'll continue to observe the progress that you will be making. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Utah, Mr. McAdams, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Scharf, for being here today. It was almost 1 year ago when another Wells Fargo CEO sat in that same chair, promising to turn the company around. And I'll repeat to you what I told Mr. Sloan then. I want Wells Fargo to succeed because I want these bad practices to cease. And for customers, for veterans, for small businesses, I want them not to be taken advantage of. I want Wells Fargo to succeed because Wells has 3,000 employees in my state. And I want those employees to be proud of where they work and not to have a workplace that pushes them to act unethically or illegally. And I hope and I believe that you share these same sentiments. So, Mr. Scharf, you generally accept that Wells Fargo failed its customers, failed its employees, and must do substantially better, correct?
Congressman, yes, I do.
Thank you. And look, I'm glad you answered that way because to answer otherwise would start us off on a very bad foot. The extent of Wells' failures over the last decade, they run far and wide. So let's talk about how we do better. Before the hearing today, I reread the note that you sent to all employees on your first day as CEO, and I really appreciated that note. One of the points you made in that communication was that Wells needed to move with a sense of urgency, and you said that all stakeholders expect you to move forward faster than ever, but at the top of that list is to remediate past issues. And one of the things in the majority staff report was that Wells Fargo's board and management prioritized financial and other considerations above fixing issues that were identified by regulators. Can you commit to me and to this committee that you will prioritize fixing the past mistakes of Wells rather than prioritizing short-term profits?
Congressman, these are the most important issues we have. We will prioritize them at the top of everything. I will not only commit to you here. I've told employees that verbally, I've told them that in letters, and I've told our shareholders that on an earnings call.
Thank you, and we expect to see that happen, but thank you for your commitment to that. Also in your note to employees was that your people set you apart, and that the best and brightest people work for Wells. And I pressed Mr. Sloan on employee issues last year and the ability for employees to raise concerns, and his answers displayed a lack of understanding of the magnitude of the problem that he had at the company. At the heart of the past Wells scandal, I think, was a culture issue. A culture where profit was king and where employees didn't feel like they could raise their voices to flag concerning activities. Can you please tell me how you're soliciting employee feedback and incorporating your feedback into your plans?
Congressman, we do employee surveys, and I think even more important than actually doing the survey is making sure employees know that you read them, you listen to it, and you're going to do something about it. So I've spoken about the results that I've seen in the employee survey, and many of the actions that we've taken are a result of what we've seen. We have town hall meetings. I host a town hall meeting every quarter of every employee inside the company, and I encourage people to give me feedback, and I get feedback. I get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of emails anytime I send something out, not just after those quarterly meetings, and even between then.
And are you ensuring that employees can give that feedback anonymously? And it sounds like they can give it outside of the ordinary chain of command, but also do so anonymously so they're not afraid of retaliation?
Congressman, absolutely. I get both signed as well as anonymous, and then we also have a hotline where people can talk to us anonymously.
Thank you, Mr. Scharf. Changing topics, one thing that's been dominating my discussions with constituents has been coronavirus and how best to prepare for its potential effects on families, our economy, and on our government. And as more employees are affected and forced to quarantine, the economic effects of that will weigh heavily on those individuals and on their families. How are they going to put food on their table, or how are they going to pay their mortgage, et cetera? How is a small business owner going to keep the lights on as his or her supply chain is disrupted? Can you tell me what steps Wells Fargo is prepared to take to respond to this pandemic and how it will assist its individual and small business customers who are struggling due to lost income or business disruptions? Are there such things as loan forbearance, flexible repayment schedules, late payment fee waivers, et cetera?
Congressman, this is something that we absolutely want our customers to look at us as a source of strength for them. We don't know where this ends, and it's something that we think about and understand the impact it'll have on individuals' lives. And we do ask the question, both for our employees as well as our customers, what can we do to be there for them? So as of today, not as of today, but sitting here today, we have a number set up that we're publicizing to our customers where they can call us, talk about their hardships. We will talk to them about extension of fees. We'll talk to them about other things that we could do for their loans.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Stile, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I yield to my colleague, Mr. Gooden of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Stile, and thank you for being here. I just had a few questions. A yes or no will suffice, but feel free to answer as long as you'd like. Is Wells Fargo the largest bank in the world?
No, Wells Fargo is not the largest.
Is it the largest bank in the Western Hemisphere?
No, we're not.
What about North America?
No, we're not.
So not the United States either, I'm guessing.
No, Congressman.
Of the banks that are larger than Wells Fargo, are you aware of any that were involved in a scandal of such magnitude as Wells Fargo's, and if so, about how many?
I'm not aware of another bank that's had the extent of the issues that we've had.
So I guess what I'm getting at is it's obvious that there are large banks in this country that are doing a pretty good job. And is it fair to say that Wells Fargo's problems are perhaps unique and you all are trying to get to a point where, like the other large banks in our nation, they're able to operate fairly smoothly and honestly despite being large?
Congressman, I do believe that we've not been run the way we should be run, and our culture wasn't what it should be. And but it's possible to change those things, and it is possible to run the company well.
I appreciate that, and thank you for being here. You know, I also wanted to kind of just make an observation. I'm looking through some of the majority's reports, and it's been very helpful, and I appreciate all the work they put into it. Before I made that observation, I was just going to point out, we've had the head of the OCC here, I guess last month it was, and kind of one of the overarching themes was that there was mismanagement going on, and he was, to paraphrase, doing the bidding of the Trump administration. A report that this committee put out, a news release on February 3rd, 2020, kind of really blasted the FDIC's and OCC's plans to weaken components of the Volcker rule. And in the press releases that I've read, it made clear that they held these accountability groups, the FDIC, the OCC, responsible for putting out for doing the wishes of the Trump administration. So they kind of blamed the administration for decisions by the OCC. The reason I bring that up is because when I look at this report, page 23, committee staff findings, and I don't dispute these findings, I'm sure they're accurate. It says, before the 2016 and 2018 consent orders, financial regulators knew about serious enterprise-wide deficiencies at Wells Fargo for years without alerting the public. Well, our great president was elected in 2016. And so when I read all these deficiencies and regulatory efforts, page 24, on April 19th, 2017, a report issued by the OCC's Office of Enterprise Government and the Ombudsman reviewing the OCC's supervision of the bank sales practices concluded that the OCC did not take timely and effective supervisory actions. The OCC failed to conduct comprehensive reviews and testing of monitoring systems and controls over sales practices between 2011 in 2014. That is right in the middle of the Obama administration. I just can't help but wonder how this report would read if a Republican were in the White House during the years of mismanagement by the regulatory groups that just allowed this to go on. And so my conclusion that I'd like to make is that the Trump administration has really done a great job. In their first 2 years, they have executed on enforcement action, and I think that things are really turning around. And I want to applaud the Trump administration for their progress. I'm disappointed that so much of this was apparently asleep at the switch actions during the Obama administration. But I wish you luck, and I thank you for coming here before us today. And I yield back to the chairwoman.
The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing along with our ranking member, and thank you, Mr. Scharf, for being here. In 2018, the Federal Reserve imposed an asset cap on Wells Fargo due to, in part, pending compliance issues at that time. Despite this, Wells Fargo remains one of the country's biggest banks, but that wasn't always the case. In 1998, Wells Fargo merged with Northwest. In 2017, the independent directors of Wells Fargo released a report on the company's sales practices, and they found that the company's focus on cross-selling and aggressive sales goals came largely from Northwest. Mr. Scharf, is that correct to your knowledge?
That is what I've been told, but I don't have any evidence of that.
In the decade after Northwest merger, Wells Fargo acquired the National Bank of Alaska, First Security Corporation, HD Vest Financial Services, Placer Sierra Bank, Greater Bay Bancorp, United Bank Corporation of Wyoming, and on, but you get the point, lots of mergers. Then in 2008, Wells Fargo acquired Wachovia, doubling the size of the bank. Is that correct, approximately?
I believe so.
Okay. Again, according to the independent director's report, Wells Fargo's, quote, sales-oriented culture, end of quote, quickly spread through Wachovia branches. Is that correct?
I do believe the Wells Fargo management model was implemented in the Wachovia branches, yes.
So from my perspective, these constant acquisitions have not only made Wells Fargo bigger and more complex, but have also brought irresponsible and illegal corporate practices to more and more customers, thus the consent pieces that are out there. Mr. Scharf, if the Federal Reserve releases Wells Fargo from its asset cap, will you commit to not pushing for more acquisitions?
Congressman, I'm not thinking about anything like that today. What I'm thinking about is the work that we have to do. And I think that there are examples, plenty of examples of acquisitions that have taken place where companies have been run properly. Our issues relate to the fact that we didn't have the appropriate management in place, we didn't have the appropriate controls in place, we didn't have the appropriate risk infrastructure in place.
As you have pointed out, so that sort of sounds like a no to me. But frankly, Wells Fargo, unchanged by your response, continues to illustrate how endless acquisitions and mergers are dangerous. That's why I introduced with Senator Warren in the Senate the Bank Merger Review Modernization Act to stop the rubber stamping of bank mergers. Between 2006 and 2017, the Fed reviewed 3,819 bank merger applications. It approved all of them. As banks get larger and larger, they become more difficult to manage, as I'm sure you'll experience, to regulate and enforce existing rules on. They risk becoming too big to fail and put our entire economy at risk. This endangers all of us, but especially working class families like the ones that I represent in Chicago and a part of the suburbs. After the 2008 crash, dozens of my friends, neighbors, and constituents were foreclosed on. We sold my parents' two-flat. The impact of big banks, greed wiped out wealth for millions, including more than half of the wealth that Black Americans owned in our country. We cannot let that happen again. My bill requires Consumer Financial Protection Bureau approval of mergers, requires regulators to evaluate systemic risk factors of proposed mergers, requires disclosure of discussions between institutions and regulators that go on before the merger is filed, and more. We need this bill so that what happened at Wells, illegal practices on an enormous scale, won't happen again. Thank you, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Zeldin, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters and Ranking Member McHenry, for holding this hearing. Thank you, Mr. Scharf, for being here today for your testimony. And we met recently. I found you to be highly motivated to do a good job, genuine, candid with all of your answers. And as someone who represents the 1st Congressional District of New York, where you have been spotted from time to time on the beautiful east end of Long Island, we're proud to see you at the position that you're at now. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the veterans issues that I had discussed with your predecessor last time he was here. You can't be blamed for what happened before you arrived, but you're here today to answer questions about the path forward, and that's much appreciated. You've publicly highlighted initiatives that you're undertaking, including a flatter line of business organizational structure that reorganizes leader responsibilities, specifically by creating 5 principal lines of business to ensure clear authority, accountability, and responsibility. It's clear you want to communicate progress, but also be upfront about what went wrong. So under previous leadership, Wells Fargo had an unfortunate history of wrongly treating active duty service members and veterans. For example, it's been widely documented that the bank improperly repossessed cars from active military service members and overcharged veterans for refinancing their mortgages. Can you elaborate on some of the initiatives that you've been working on to help veterans in the wake of the scandal?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. First of all, I should start with just the statement that we have zero tolerance for SCRA errors inside the company. The things that you described, as well as some of the other things that others have described and the harm that we've caused, is completely inexcusable and is just flies in the face of who we should be as a company. Specifically for members of the current military and former military, we've got the utmost respect for what they do. And so we have to make sure that for that population, as well as for other populations, that we've got all of the right controls in place. What I believe that we have in place and is effective at this point is a centralized group to review all of those that are covered by SCRA to ensure that those mistakes where harm was caused doesn't happen again. As we continue to go through my process of reviewing the company piece by piece, we will go and look at that to ensure it's as robust as it needs to be across all the businesses inside the company. But I'm told that people believe that's the case today, but we will verify it.
Thank you, and I appreciated a continued open line of communication between you and not just myself and my team, but everyone on this committee on that issue, which is close to my heart, as I would imagine it is for everyone on this committee. Transitioning a little, I just wanted to talk about a topic that's of growing concern to me and my constituents, the debanking of legitimate lawful businesses due to pressure from social activists. I'll give you an example. I'm the proud lead of H.R. 5595, the Israel Anti-Boycott Act, which would prohibit boycotts or requests for boycotts imposed by international governmental organizations against Israel and would protect American companies from being coerced to provide information to those organizations for the purpose of furthering boycotts against Israel. This legislation does not impede the right of any individual American to boycott or criticize Israel. It's okay to have reasonable, legitimate criticism of any government, including our own or our allies like Israel. But this hate-fueled movement is not all about affirming the rights of Palestinians. Likewise, the pressure and coercion from those cloaked under the guise of social activism to debank lawful, legitimate businesses in the U.S. is not only wrong, but I worry this type of tactic could seep into insidious movements like the BDS movement when it comes to pressuring those who provide financial services. I understand you're running a bank and that lending requires discretion in underwriting, but can you assure me that Wells Fargo's internal processes will not discriminate against credit-worthy individuals and businesses, no matter how those in the public with loud extreme opinions may try to cut off access for them?
Congressman, we intend to treat all individuals fairly.
Thank you. There's been an immense amount of public power and government-granted advantages entrusted to banks to facilitate commerce, and they should not abuse those privileges, acting as de facto regulators. And my time is up, so I'll yield back.
The gentlewoman from Texas, Mrs. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding this very important hearing so that we have an opportunity to visit with the CEO of Wells Fargo Bank. And Mr. Scharf, I know that we were originally scheduled to have you come by the office to visit, and it got canceled and not rescheduled, so could we work on that? I wanted to quickly ask you, on February 12th, Wells Fargo announced that it would no longer require mandatory arbitration for future sexual harassment claims by employees. I applaud you for that. I think that's a step in the right direction. However, Wells Fargo still includes mandatory arbitration provisions in their credit card agreements and in their consumer account agreements. When can we see changes there? This body passed a bill, and the House has passed a bill to end arbitration clauses in contractual agreements. I know I personally have been forced to sign some and didn't want to. So when can we expect you to remove those clauses from those type of agreements?
Congressman, as you pointed out, we did make those changes to employees regarding sexual harassment. We've also been able to settle the sales practice exams without referring those to arbitration as well. So there are places that we've looked around the company. We want to have a process in place that's fair and effective for both employees and our customers. So this is something that we've just started to look through, and there's nothing more to report on that today. But as we continue to think about it, we're perfectly willing to continue to engage with you on the topic.
Great. So was this a practice that you also maintained in your previous employment in the banking industry?
I don't believe BNY Mellon had arbitration, but I'm not exactly sure.
Could we check on that too? So you're saying today that you can't commit to get us on the right track on those particular agreements?
Congresswoman, I believe that we have a goal of being fair and effective in how we handle disputes with our customers and our employees. There are different ways to accomplish that, and we're going to look and determine what we think is the best way to do that.
Well, this body has found that arbitration clauses were not fair to the consumer, and I can tell you as a consumer myself, I find them really repugnant, and as an attorney and a former judge, I find them repugnant. I know that you also deny consumers the right to participate in any class action lawsuits or class arbitrations against the bank. Is that true, and when can we see a change in that?
Congressman, I don't know the specifics of that.
You don't?
I do not.
Okay. Well, when you go back to your office, could you check into that or add it on your list so we can work on that also?
Glad to talk to you about that.
Well, great. Thank you. Now, I want to go back to an answer that you gave to one of my colleagues earlier when we were talking about a lot of the accountability issues with the prior management of the bank. And you said that you will no longer use any reviews based on sales, that you would be focused on customer service, and that you would look at balanced growth. What does that mean?
Congressman, I was referring to the incentive plans that have been changed, specifically in the consumer bank, where the meaningful part of the compensation was based upon sales goals that led to this behavior. Those have been removed, and there are now several different pieces that go into the evaluation, one of which is customer experience,
Correct.
The second has to do with balances that exist inside the customer accounts.
You mean the dollar balances, or what
Yes,
kind
the
of
dollar
balances you're
balances.
talking about?
The dollar balances.
So they'll score more points on their reviews if they handle a $1 million bank account versus a consumer account of $100?
No, what we do is we look at, instead of just looking at the numbers of accounts, because the numbers of accounts is a big part of what led to the problems that existed, is we want to attract more balances inside of the branches. We have different bankers who cover different customers at different wealth levels.
Correct.
So that we aren't judging those that deal with.
But you're not suggesting that the bigger the bank account number, the better treatment that person's going to get, and if
no, absolutely.
the average Joe walks in with a $200 bank account, they're going to get treated differently because the person reviewed is going to get more points for the higher value.
They should not be treated differently.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. You're back.
The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Porter, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Scharf, have you seen Harold and Kumar go to White Castle?
Excuse me?
Have you seen the movie Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle?
No, I've not, Congresswoman.
So there's a famous scene in that movie where Neil Patrick Harris borrows the car and completely trashes it. And Wells Fargo lends money to consumers to buy cars, and Wells Fargo wants the consumers to take good care of the car. That's the collateral. Protect that value. But there's always this Neil Patrick Harris risk. Someone trashes the car, defaults on the loan, and the value's not enough, and there's a risk of a loss. To guard against that loss, Wells Fargo has consumers pay for GAP waivers. GAP stands for Guaranteed Auto Protection, and the GAP waiver cancels the remaining balance on the loan if the regular auto liability payout after the car is damaged is insufficient. But when someone pays off the loan, there is no need for that GAP waiver. There's no need for debt cancellation because the debt is paid off. But you, Wells Fargo, keep charging for that GAP waiver. You didn't tell consumers after they paid off the loan early that you owed them money back, about $350 each. Effectively, the bank stole this money from 1.7 million consumers nationwide, leaving Wells Fargo sitting on over $600 million in ill-gotten gains. How much of that $600 million that Wells Fargo owes consumers in GAP overcharges has been returned?
Congresswoman, I don't know the exact number sitting here of what we've returned.
The chart on the side, this is how much you owe, $600 million. This is how much you've returned, 0. You told me in my office that Wells Fargo in the past has been penny wise but pound foolish, and I agreed, resisting doing what's right and paying consumers. And I really saw that when I was the monitor for the state of California during foreclosure crisis. So if you're here today to tell us that Wells Fargo has changed its ways, you should have no problem committing to giving these people their own money back in terms of GAP overcharges. Will you commit to give them their money back?
Congresswoman, there's no question if we have harmed customers, then we should in fact do that, and we'll go back and take a look at the specific example and understand why it hasn't been done and how we can move quickly to rectify it.
This is the pleading in that case that's pending, in which Wells Fargo is currently arguing that even though it charged people for many years of GAP insurance and the consumer paid off the loan early, they have not in fact refunded that GAP insurance. And that $350 means a lot. It's 18 bags of groceries for families. So I would love for you to commit to doing that. I also wanted to ask you, have you heard of the song, Mamas Don't Let Your Babies Grow Up to Be Cowboys?
I don't believe I have.
It's written by an American hero, Willie Nelson. I have 3 kids, Mr. Scharf, and I'm thinking of writing a new song, Mama Don't Let Your Babies Grow Up to Be Bank Tellers. Mr. Scharf, how many of your tellers are currently receiving public assistance in this country?
I'm not aware, Congresswoman.
Right now, 1/3 of bank tellers in the United States receive public assistance. Madam Chair, I'd like permission to enter into the record the study from the University of California, Berkeley, that shows that the cost of public benefits to families of bank tellers is almost $900 million per year.
Without objection, such is the order.
So taxpayers are subsidizing Wells Fargo's wages to the tune of $900 million per year. I don't want my kids to grow up and be Wells Fargo tellers because statistically speaking, one of the three would end up needing public assistance. Is Wells Fargo profitable? Is Wells Fargo profitable?
I believe it is, yes, Congresswoman.
You believe? I mean, it's $19.5 billion last year, so we can round that up to $20 billion. That's profit. So the bank can afford to pay its tellers significantly more. Do you think the hardworking taxpayers of this country should be shoring up Wells Fargo's tellers' salaries when the bank has profits of $20 billion a year and paid out $30 billion in buybacks and dividends last year?
Congresswoman, I believe we should pay people fairly, and I believe the actions that we've taken, especially recently by raising the minimum wage, does in fact do that. We also, in addition to—
You raised the wage only in high-cost areas, however, not across the board. You raised the wage only in high-cost areas, not across the board.
We raised our wages in 4 different tiers.
With that, I yield back.
The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Scharf, for a long day here. I want to shift a little bit to some of the recent market activities, specifically in the oil sector. And I'm an energy guy by history. I don't want to make too much of one-day volatility, but certainly the fact that it's clear after yesterday's news that Russian and Saudi interests are not aligned with our own and need to brace ourselves for a potential downturn. As I'm sure you know, in the 2016 period, Wells Fargo, your energy fund, was exposed to significant losses because of the Cubic Energy bankruptcy. And what I'd like to understand is how much capital does Wells Fargo currently, how much capital exposure does Wells Fargo currently have exposed to the oil and gas sector?
Congressman, I don't have that number sitting right here. The last time I looked at our exposure as a percentage of our total loan exposure as well as our percentage of equity, and it looks similar to what the other larger banks have.
Okay, and you tell me if this is right. If there is exposure, would it all be in the? I guess you now call it the Wells Fargo Energy Group. Is that where all the energy lending would take place?
I'm not sure, Congressman.
Okay, I'm looking at and this is just off your website. It's an October 2018 report. So none of those about right, but it says that you have $42 billion committed to public and private companies across the upstream, midstream, downstream services. And if I'm just looking at this, it says 41% in exploration and production, 15% in midstream. If I think exploration, production, pipelines, that's perhaps $23 billion of exposure to this waste. Does that feel about right to you? And I'm trying to do the math in my head. I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
I'll take your word for it if you've got the document, Congressman.
Do you have any sense of how much of that is in equity versus debt?
No, I don't, Congressman.
Okay, and again, I'm just trying to do the math. In your most recent 10K, it said that your total loan portfolio for oil, gas, and pipeline was $13.56 billion. I'm assuming that's just the debt side, so is it a reasonable guess that there's maybe $10 billion in equity, ballpark?
Congressman, I don't know the specifics sitting here today.
Okay. Can you estimate on the debt side how much would be second lien versus senior debt?
No, I can't sitting here today, Congressman.
Okay. Well, I suspect we're going to have a lot of you don't knows, but if you could get back to us on all these, do you know how far the oil price would have to fall for your senior loans to be in technical default, just on an asset to value test?
Congressman, we have a risk function and a business function that I'm sure has run models like that. That specific question, I don't have the answer to.
Okay. Do you have, even I won't hold you to this. Do you have any general sense, given the oil market volatility right now, how concerned your risk function is about that oil market volatility?
Congressman, we are. There's certainly a heightened degree of activity around the oil and gas exposures that we have. When we took those exposures, we took them in the context of what we thought the risk we could tolerate. And so beyond that, I can't answer additional questions on it.
Okay, well, do you think your exposure is sort of representative of the industry, of the broader banking industry?
Again, I can't speak for the rest of the industry, and I don't know the specifics of their exposures.
Do you have any idea how much you've got in reserved for potential losses in the sector?
I don't sitting here today, and I'm not sure it's something I'd want to share broadly anyway.
Okay. Well, I'll follow up. If you could get answers back in writing. What I'm trying to understand is what is the systemic risk created to the entire banking sector of which you are a participant if there is a sustained reduction in the value on the books of the oil companies in this country. And I'll leave you, when Cubic Energy went bankrupt, John Ross, and again, where you took a complete wipeout on the equity, John Ross, their vice president of operations, said, what is really worth anything at $40 oil and $2 gas? It's hard for me to say right now. Now, the answer for the equity holders, including Wells Fargo, was zero. As of today, West Texas crude is at $34, and natural gas, Henry Hub, is at $1.90. It's a concern for me that you don't know. I realize this is just recent news, but if you could get back to us with some sense of what the exposure is and how concerned we should be about broader market exposure in the banking sector, I would appreciate it.
Congressman, I can assure you that it's a topic of conversation inside the company.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Good to see you, Mr. Scharf. Sort of three questions, two that kind of follow along Ms. Porter's questions and then Mr. Kasten's questions, one more general about the company. A wise man once told me, problems don't age very well. And this gap insurance, the guaranteed asset protection, where Wells Fargo has received a premium to cover the loss of a car, then the car is either sold and Wells Fargo's paid off, or they've refinanced it, car's paid off. Wells continues to hold that full premium. And there are cases out there brought against the company to recover that. There's small dollar amounts. And as somebody who's been outside counsel to financial institutions, your outside lawyers are going to say, we can fight this, we can require arbitration, we can make everybody come in to get their $322. And you know what? We'll be better off as an institution. But I would remind you of this wise saying, problems don't age very well. And as chief executive officer, I would just ask that you consider Ms. Porter's discussion and also that pleading and take a look at just getting it settled, because these things need to get behind the bank, which brings me to sort of my second point. I think the thing that really has been difficult for both the Democrats and Republicans is just the series of consent orders, the delay from the first one to today. And, the question, I think both reports to different magnitudes, there was an issue with management, issue with the boards, issue with the regulators. And I think for us, the question is, were the board of directors derelict in their duty, or is the culture of the company such that it's difficult to get your arms around it, or is this company too big to manage? And I'd just like to get your sort of response to that.
Thank you, Congressman. I think it is absolutely possible to run a company like Wells Fargo well, and there are a series of things that we haven't done to categorize itself as running well, and that's evident in our lack of ability to make progress in some of these activities that we've spoken about today. Our culture did work against us. It's not what it needs to be. We haven't had the right management structure of the company in place. We haven't had the right people in place, and we certainly didn't have the right priorities set across the company. And then I've also spoken today about the fact that we didn't have the right accountability for people then to be able to map what those priorities were to what it meant for them. I think when you put those things together, you get the right people in the right seats, and you run the company very differently, it is possible to have a very different outcome than we've seen.
Okay. Last one is, and the proof will be in the pudding. I mean, further delays are only going to be problems that continue to age and not good for the company. And as a customer, I've been a customer of the bank for 40 years, and I've had some of those issues, in my own accounts. So I want to see the company right its ship and just do good. Last thing is the softball I want to give you, and that is if you were sitting up here and you've got coronavirus and you see small businesses potential victims of a recession, the tourism industry, hospitality, and then you couple that with this fight between Russia and Saudi Arabia on oil. If you were sitting up here as a member of Congress on the Financial Services Committee, thinking that a recession is potential, what should we be looking for in the financial sector generally to help stem off something that would get worse?
Congressman, I would certainly look and ask the question, what are the banks doing in order to do what they can to support all the individuals that are affected by this? We don't know how far it will go, but we know that it is significant, and we know that there are things that we can do to help the individuals, both at our own companies, the consumers who are our clients, but also the impacted consumers of the corporations that we do business with.
And just sort of a last point, I mean, those that could be really affected, some things were done by your bank during our shutdown. I would ask that you consider to do some of similar things to help those affected individuals. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I do think it's important that many folks understand, I think what our chairwoman is trying to do is not called intimidation. It's called doing her job. I mean, this report alone is doing her job as chairwoman of financial services and somebody that oversees, especially oversees actions by banks like yours that, many people are calling it a cultural issue, right? It's called cheating. The definition of cheating is to act dishonestly or unfairly in order to gain an advantage. I don't understand why we're calling it culture when it's a criminal scheme. Page 13 of the report, alone what you did to service members in our country that were facing evictions is alone something that to me is just a criminal scheme that you all got away with. And understandably, my colleagues will try to be a little bit more forgiving, but when somebody in my community, a resident that defrauds the government, they actually go to jail. They get prosecuted. So I'm really taken aback by folks that don't understand the consumer abuse by the company and dismissing it and kind of belittling it as a cultural issue. It's not. It's a criminal scheme. You all got caught doing something that was extremely disgusting and disadvantaged so many of our folks, especially frontline communities like mine. Your predecessor at Wells Fargo made about $18.4 million in 2018. Did you know that?
I've read that, yes.
Yeah. That's 283 times more than the median income for your employees.
Yes.
So my question to you, do you think it's appropriate for a bank caught cheating to not address the excessive executive pay at Wells Fargo, at the bank you now oversee?
Congresswoman, I'm focused on making sure that we treat everyone fairly going forward.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So do you know when you all don't pay a living wage to our residents, many of them are employees, they live in our communities, that because you don't pay a living wage, they end up going on assistance. So we have to cover health coverage maybe that you all don't provide adequate health coverage, or they have to get a second job. And that's something you should absolutely write down, Mr. Scharf, and find out what is actually happening in the lives of the people that serve in your company. One of the things that I've been trying to figure out is, is there an amount of CEO pay that you would consider inappropriate, right? So yes or no, would you recommend that you or any other bank executives should have to forfeit some of your own compensation to pay any penalties Wells Fargo faces under your leadership?
Congresswoman, I think all of the activities that occur should be factored into the CEO's compensation.
But aren't you, I mean, this is like, how many CEOs do we have since all this? Like, I'm looking at the dates here. This has been 10 years, and people are trying to say this is an issue with my chair. Our chairwoman, this is 10 years of doing these to real people that lost their homes, lost their lives. This stuff is on our credit report still, probably, while you all still settle out of court and get away with it. You know, I have a CEO tax bill, and it's really important. I encourage my colleagues to look at this because I think it's critically important. The Tax Excessive CEO Pay Act, I co-lead with Representative Lee and Senator Sanders. This bill would actually put a penalty on all banks and corporations with big gaps between CEO and worker pay. It's important that we give banks and corporations incentives to end practices that put all of us at risk. I say this to you all because I'm really tired of us subsidizing, literally subsidizing for you all not even paying a living wage to the residents that work for the company. And on top of that, you're actually also around the corner scamming them. And I am not convinced, and it's no fault of your own, Mr. Scharf, or maybe it is because you chose this role. You coming here and continuing saying that's before my time. If I went to my community in 13 District Strong and said to them, I just got here, I don't know, they would literally just push and hold me accountable and say, you need to know. So we're telling you, come before this committee, you should have been much more prepared in acknowledging and owning what this company has done before, because that's not changing culture when you don't even acknowledge that that's exactly what you inherited, is a criminal scheme by your company that is literally leaving people on the streets. And do not take, this is not personal, Mr. Scharf. This is literally like life and death for our residents at home. So when you come here and you don't have answers, then it's really a disgrace, and honestly, it's disrespectful to this chamber. You cannot come here and continue to say, I'm new. That's not the right answer. It should be,
Congresswoman, I'm
I have
sorry
the
you feel
answer.
that way. I think I provided many answers about what I'm doing.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentlewoman from Ohio, Mrs. Beatty, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witness. I'm interested in how you plan to run the bank. So first, let me start with, do you know what you inherited when you took this job? And mine are going to be yes or no's to move us. You've had a long day. Did you know, do you think you were adequately prepared to know what you were inheriting? Yes or no?
I was as
yes
prepared
or no?
I was as prepared as I could be. It's not
so is that a yes? You were adequately prepared. Is that a yes?
I was as prepared as I could
okay,
be.
so that's a no answer. Can you tell me if you think you were adequately prepared for this hearing today? Yes or no, please? And it's for the sake of time. I've waited a long time.
I've done the best that I can.
So were you
4 months that I've
adequately
been there.
prepared by your team for this hearing? It's a yes or no.
Congresswoman, that's for others to determine.
Well, no, I'm asking you, you're sitting in the chair, you're our witness, do you think you were adequately prepared? And this is not a I got you question. I have a good reason for this that I was hoping as the CEO that you would say yes. That you, because now you're leaving me to believe that you came
I was,
here.
but I think it's
okay, so then
for others to determine.
So then let me ask it this way. What do you believe? Do you believe you were adequately prepared?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Now, are you familiar with the interest of the subcommittee chair people on this committee? So do you know what I chair on the subcommittee?
You chair the diversity subcommittee.
Okay, so see, that's a thank you. It appears that you were adequately prepared to know what I chair. Did you read the Wells Fargo's report that was submitted to my subcommittee?
No, I did not, Congresswoman.
That's disappointing. And I'm very serious. So now I can answer the question. You were not adequately prepared. For you to come here and say to me, one of the biggest things that we're doing in moving this needle, and then you want to wonder why people ask you questions, because when we talk about moving the needle for inclusion, we're also looking at closing the wealth gap. We're looking at pay equity. It is far beyond race and ethnicity and gender. It is about rural people. It is about veterans. It is about how we move the needle to make sure that people have equality and not injustices. I'm very sad that because you can't answer half the rest of my questions since you didn't even take the time to look at the report. I've been very consistent. I asked the same questions for the last 6 years. To every CEO that has been in this room, this is my life mission, to make sure that women and minorities, and specifically for me, African Americans, stand a fair chance in the world that you operate and in the world that you run. So, from the transcript, when they talked about hiring you, I don't know if you will remember this, but let me quote. It said that you were passionate about diversity and inclusion, and that you were committed to work with a talented management pool of people. And then you answered and said you were excited to come on board to do those things. See how I'm connecting the dots? If they thought you were passionate and committed to diversity and inclusion, and yet you don't read or look at the D&I report, and you knew you were coming before this committee, and I have asked every single person the same question. So let me ask you this. Can you give me a commitment as you're talking about cleaning the house, bringing on new people? Do you or will you have a diversity and inclusion executive on your team? Yes or no?
Yes,
do you have one?
Yes, we do.
Does that person report to you?
No, she does not.
Wrong answer. If you really believe in diversity and inclusion, you're going to move it. That person, especially with all the inequities that you have and the lack of addressing the questions that my colleagues have asked, you should look at that person reporting to you. Now, you have a seat on the board. I get the point that you don't serve on the nominating committee. So the question to you is, will you push for something like the Rooney Rule, sitting there as a board member, or do you even know what the Rooney Rule is? Have you heard of it?
I do, and
so then you know the Rooney Rule. I have a piece of legislation, thanks to our chairwoman, called the Beatty Rule, that was put into legislation and actually passed. Will you participate in doing that? Yes or no?
I will. I can certainly have the conversation. I'd be supportive of it, but it is the.
How many people are of color and women and are diverse on the board?
30% are women and 20% are diverse.
Sorry, my time is up and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Before we adjourn the hearing, I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina to close.
Well, thank you for your testimony today. First, I think we have to say that you've outlined an aggressive plan for the institutions needed. You'll be held accountable by your regulators. You'll be held accountable by your board. You'll be held accountable by your shareholders. And you're certainly going to be held accountable by those that make the law here on Capitol Hill and have oversight over those regulators. What's clear is, in the history of your institution, wrong was committed. But this hearing today was about the forward-looking nature of this. So I want to be clear about the legislative side of this and how we got here today. There have been 5 reports issued by this committee, 3 by Republicans, 2 by Democrats. Now, we had access to the same information from the majority and minority. After the Wells Fargo sales practice scandal came to light in 2016, the committee's Republican chairman opened an investigation. That's Jeb Henseling when Republicans are in charge of the House. He called the CEO to testify and requested documents and information from your company and the company's regulators. All told, Henseling obtained about 170,000 pages of documents from your institution and from regulators. He had issued subpoenas to get some of those documents. He had issued subpoenas to get documents from our regulators that we have oversight over, and that was during the Obama administration. So Democrats were in those jobs, but it had to be a Republican subpoena to get that information. But both majority and minority at the time get those same documents. So we have that same sort of insight into this process. At the time, the Democrat minority issued a report. Republicans issued 2 reports during that last Congress. So then you fast forward to 2019, and Democrats are now in charge of the House of Representatives. changeover at the regulators as well. And so we had requests for additional information from Wells and the regulators, and another 370,000 pages are turned over without a single subpoena from your institution or from regulators. Now, the key difference is that every single one of those pages came without a subpoena from the regulators. That was different under the Trump administration than it was, for instance, under Richard Cordray and the CFPB, where we had to subpoena those documents. Now, this CFPB and this director freely handed those documents over. Necessary documents for us to have oversight over your institution and ensuring that that our laws are appropriate and the enforcement is appropriate. So between us, we obtained about 500,000 pages of documents that both the Democrats and Republicans on this committee have. We have key findings of fact that are a real indictment for your institution, Wells Fargo, an absolute indictment for your institution. Key findings of fact of wrongdoing, breaking laws, not adhering to regulation, failing to comply with consent decrees, failing to comply with what the institution pledged. So we agree on those facts. Now we come to two different conclusions about how to deal with your institution and institutions of your size. And that becomes a decision for policymakers to make on what to do about those key findings of facts. And we have a disagreement, and that's an honest disagreement between Republicans and Democrats. But the key findings of facts were bipartisan in nature. So we know that. Now it's a question what to do with it. I think we need to have strong oversight of you. You need to have better management practices and adhere to existing law, and we can continue to go along with the current law and legal structures that we have for institutions of your size. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. Before we conclude today's hearing, I yield myself 4 minutes to describe the process the majority undertook to conduct our Wells Fargo investigation and create the report with its findings. Over a year ago, at my direction, the majority staff initiated an investigation into Wells Fargo's compliance with 5 consent orders. Majority committee staff requested and reviewed about 330,000 pages of records in the course of the investigation. Majority committee staff also received briefings from the Federal Reserve, the OCC, the CFPB, the SEC, and Wells Fargo, and conducted interviews with key executives at Wells Fargo and the former chair of the board's risk committee. In addition, they interviewed officials at the Federal Reserve, OCC, and CFPB. The documents which served as the basis for the majority staff report, and which the minority also used for their report, were obtained because the majority staff spent months working to obtain them from regulators and the bank. The regulators and the bank did not offer these documents up on their own, but instead only provided them to us after months and months of intense but productive negotiation. The majority staff determined the focus of this investigation, drafted the document request to the OCC, the CFPB, and the Federal Reserve, Wells Fargo Bank and Wells Fargo's Board of Directors, and determine the scope of those inquiries. The majority staff selected the witnesses the committee interviewed and negotiated their appearances for interviews. At the same time, Republican staff had access to all documents and had the opportunity to participate in all formal interviews. I would like to publicly acknowledge the work of the following key majority staff members, without whose year-long effort this report would not have been possible. Bruce Johnson, Deputy Chief Oversight Counsel; Carolyn Hahn, Senior Counsel; and I would also like to acknowledge Kevin Burris, the Chief Oversight Counsel; Christine Baltazar, Paralegal; Glenn Sears, Director of Consumer Protection Policy; Avi Malik, Senior Counsel; Yana Miles, Senior Counsel; Pierre Watley, Professional Staff; Eric Harrisey, Communications Director; Eric Lowe, Deputy Communications Director; Marcos Manasalvas, Digital Director; and Eden Harris, Press Assistant. The majority's investigation revealed deeply troubling failures on the part of the bank's board, management, and regulators, and shows that the bank is still broken and continues to harm consumers. It also made clear that Congress needs to act to ensure that a mega bank can never again escape accountability to the public or responsibility to harmed consumers. At this hearing, we've made it clear to Mr. Scharf that this committee is keeping a close eye on Wells Fargo and will be holding them accountable to ending the bank's egregious pattern of consumer abuse. It has an immense task ahead of him, and the committee will not relent in its scrutiny of the bank until its appalling practices end for good. And mega banks understand they are not above the law. No matter what is being said about who did what and when, I'm in charge of this committee. I have the gavel, and we have put together this report. We're going to follow up with it, and all of the information, incorrect information that has been shared today about who's responsible for what, we're responsible for this report. We stand by it. So I'd like to thank our witnesses for the testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for this purpose. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you're able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. The hearing is now adjourned. Thank you.
The test is considered presumptive positive. The Oklahoma State Department of Health Laboratory tested the specimen, which tested positive. That is considered presumptive positive, and that sample will be